All right, I think we're all ready. We'll call the meeting to order. First order of business, if we could have the roll call, please.
Yes, sir. For the Select Committee on Capital Financing and Investments for September 6, 2024, Representative Harshman.
Excused?
Representative Knapp. Here. Representative Larson. Here. Representative Storr.
Here.
Representative Obermueller.
Excused?
Senator Driscoll.
Here.
Senator Furphy.
Here.
Senator Guru.
Here.
Senator Hicks. Here. Senator Steinmetz.
Here.
Vice Chairman Nethercott.
Excused?
Chairman Walters.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being here on this beautiful September day. First order of business, or next order of business, I should say, will be the approval of the minutes from the June 19th, 2024 meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes from June 19, 2024? Hopefully everyone received them electronically or hard copy. Seeing none, all those in favor of approval, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Okay, the minutes will be approved as circulated. And so with that, we'll move right into our first item on the agenda in terms of legislative action, local government investment or investing rather, and start with the draft legislation. And I don't know, is Polly or Ian or Brian, one of you going to give us an overview of the bill, and you can pick which one you think we ought to start with, and Brian will turn it over to you and take off.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with your permission, I'd actually like to just briefly cover, before I get into the two bill drafts, that next bullet point, the creation of inviolate local government funds, with your permission.
You're the leader here.
Okay.
Go for it, sir.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, back in June, there was a question regarding whether local governments could establish inviolate funds. I focused the question primarily on counties and cities, and the answer is slightly different for both. In both situations, there is no statute or provision that expressly provides for the creation of these funds or prohibits the creation of these funds. So for counties, being creatures of the state, political subdivisions of the state, they're going to have the powers that the state delegates to them. For cities, it's a little different. Under home rule, it's more likely that a town or a city could establish an inviolate fund until or unless the legislature were to provide otherwise by general law. For both, though, and this is a similar concept to the legislature creating an inviolate fund by statute. If a local government were to create an inviolate fund by ordinance or resolution, nothing would preclude the governing body in the future from amending that inviolate nature. So it would have to take, if there is a desire to have local governments create inviolate funds that truly are inviolate, it would most likely require some sort of statutory or constitutional change to be able to keep those funds inviolate.
Okay, very good. Any questions for Brian regarding the creation of inviolate funds by local governments?
Okay.
Go ahead. Great explanation. Thank you for that.
Yep. So, Mr. Chairman, I will. I can do this any way you would like. I can go through both bill drafts since they both concern the same topic at once, or I can take one or the other. I would start just with 125, given that it's first on the agenda. For both bill drafts, Mr. Chairman, there are various places in these drafts where further direction from the Select Committee is going to be required. These are still fairly conceptual and will need numerous inputs, I think, before they're kind of ready to keep rolling down the track. So the first bill, 25 LSO 125, 0.5, local government funds, direct investment in equities. And this first bill draft is the one that would authorize local governments to invest directly of their own accord in stocks and equities under conditions that are specified in the bill draft. So the staff comment on the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2 just notes that under Article 16, Section 6A 2C, this bill, and the next one for that matter, would require a 2/3 vote of each house voting separately in order to be enacted. So then moving on to page 3 are 2 definitions. On line 4, the definition of local government includes county, city, township, town, school district, and any other political subdivision. And then there's a definition of political subdivision, which means a special district and any other local government entity. The staff comment on page 3, 2 notes about these definitions. First, the definition of local government is basically pulled right from the list of entities that are used in Article 16, Section 6A2C. Certainly up for the legislature to decide what the scope of those local governments should be in the bill draft, whether they all should be included, some, that would be a decision point. The next question would be whether a definition of political,
Representative Larson.
Well, and I'm sorry, Brian, I think maybe you're just ready to get to my question, but if we elected to just have local government mean county, city, and town, and avoid the political the school district or any other political subdivision, that would eliminate the need to have political subdivision, correct?
yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yep, right on track, yep. And that was going to be my next point, is even with the definition of local government, that definition may not be necessary if the legislature just wants to use the plain language meaning of political subdivision.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks.
So Brian, do we know, I'm trying to recollect when number of years we worked on special districts, but they'd be captured on this. But my recollection is there's over 650 some special districts in the state of Wyoming. And then you add in how many school districts, 48. And so pretty soon we're up to, if we left the language the way it is, you're 750 plus entities that could go out and start investing in equities. Do you know what that number is?
So Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I don't know the exact number of special districts. I know they number in the hundreds. But Mr. Chairman, as I'll explain later, there are other conditions that I think would drastically, and depending on what the committee decides, would drastically limit the number of local governments that would be authorized to invest in equities under this bill draft. So Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 4, this would create a new section, and it provides that a local government may invest any funds specified in subsection B, and I'll get to that shortly. That subsection basically says you have to have X money to invest in equities. So local government may invest in equities and stocks in accordance with all of the following. So first, the local government must create and maintain an investment advisory committee, which I'll explain more a little later. The basic idea, though, is a similar entity to the IFC that would aid that local government. Line 11, the investments must be made with a person who is registered under the Federal Investment Advisors Act if required to do so, and must maintain and have at least one physical office in Wyoming. Page 4, line 21, this is another place that I think would present a clear decision point for the committee. The fees that are incurred by a local government for investing funds, so investing in stocks and equities under this section, shall not exceed X. And I think the threshold question would be, should there be a maximum set? And if so, what should that be? On page 5, line 13, each investment shall be for a duration of not less than 5 years. And Mr. Chairman, a lot of these numbers that are plugged in here are based on items that the committee discussed when we were discussing the bill draft back in June. Funds invested in line 16, funds that are invested under this section cannot exceed the amount specified in B. The local government must specify the disposition of the earnings from these investments. Then page 5, line 26, this was a request made for each school district investing funds under this section. The school district shall not engage in or be engaged in any litigation against the state or state agency regarding school finance. The staff comment on the top of page 6 just notes that the committee may wish to consider clarifying this further. So for example, once a school district invests in stocks, Can they then later engage in litigation? What happens if they engaged in litigation before investing? That could use maybe a little more clarity and direction from the committee.
Representative Larson.
Brian, would you mind if we went back to page 4 on Roman 3 on the fees? And just confirm for me that those would be the management fees, who's ever managing the fund, the fees that they charge, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's correct.
So, and then, Mr. Chairman, that could be, the X there could be a fixed amount or a percentage, might be options.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think that's right.
And then following, Mr. Chairman, if we set that maximum, are we pretty well then establishing what the fees will be? You know, if it can't exceed X, would it be the manager said, well, you're allowed X, and that's what our fees are? Is there, so as we've seen, you know, other places as we've done, and so is this something that we've put other places on investments where that we determine what the fees can be, or is this for us, is this new to this strategy?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think, yeah, first off, certainly a decision for the committee whether that paragraph's even needed. I think that was a point of discussion that was mentioned in June, you know, as something that was of interest.
Okay, thank you. But do we, Mr. Chairman, do we make that same requirement for any of the state investment where we limit what in the retirement fund or the treasurer, do we tell them what their fees can be?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I'm not immediately aware of a statute that limits that.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Okay. Yep. Proceed. So, Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 6, line 19, subsection B requires that the amount and type of monies that are invested must be in accordance with all of the following. And the staff comment just notes that this subsection would specify what may be invested, the amount of the portfolio, maybe as an expression is expressed as a percentage that could be invested in stocks, and the total amount of funds that could be expressed. This subsection is based on Kentucky's law that authorizes local governments, and will present, I think, a number of places for committee input. So on the top of page 7, first, monies that are invested under this section must be from funds that either are in excess of some dollar amount or perhaps percentage of the local government's operating budget for the immediately preceding fiscal year, or have been held in reserves for some specified period of time.
So Brian, on that, in the Kentucky law, we'll start with Romanette A, the in excess of, did they do a percentage or a dollar amount?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I'll have to double check. I think that was a dollar amount.
Okay.
And I think another state, maybe Virginia or Colorado, had a dollar amount as well. And then they also specified if you've held this in reserve for 5 or 10 years, under conditions you could invest those. Yep.
Okay.
Then line 15, the amount of monies that are invested at any one time shall not exceed X percent of the total portfolio. Then third, on line 20, for purposes of the subsection, earnings from the investments in stocks and equities do not count toward those previous limits. And those earnings can be immediately reinvested back in the stocks and equities. Then moving on to page 8, subsection C is a subsection providing for the establishment of an investment advisory committee. And each local government that were to invest in stocks and equities under this section must establish this committee. Again, a number of decision points, and that's the staff comment on the bottom half of page 8. Whether they should be required to use a selection panel, as the IFC does, the number of members who should be on the advisory committee, the length of terms, whether an appointed or elected official, for example, the governing body's treasurer or another officer should be a member of this committee, whether a chairman should be specified in statute, and whether other duties should be specified, as well as procedures. So page 9, line 8, these are the requirements right now that would be part of this committee. So the governing body would be required to appoint members. Each investment advisory committee shall have not less than a certain number of members if there is interest. And then page 9, line 14, these are the qualifications. And as of right now, they are basically taken from the qualifications that are required of IFC members. So not less than some number of years of institutional investment experience involved in the management of portfolio in excess of a certain dollar amount. For the IFC, that dollar amount's, I believe, $500 million. A broad understanding of financial markets. You cannot have been convicted of or pleaded no contest to a felony or subject to any disciplinary action that involves moral turpitude. And then finally, note on the top of page 10, line 4, no conflicts of interest that would lead to a violation of provisions of law that prohibit conflicts of interest, so receiving a pecuniary benefit or interest for self or family and taking an unlawful interest of office holders in public contracts are the 3 statutes that are referenced there. Page 10, line 8 would be terms, if there is a desire to set maximum terms for these members. Line 11 just specifies that these members could be reappointed. And then beginning on page 10, line 14 are the duties. So they must establish and review investment policies and procedures for the investments that are made. This is very similar to the IFC language. Page 11, line 4, they must consult with the treasurer of the local government regarding the establishment and execution of the investment policies, and then report to the governing body upon request of the governing body on the investment policies, procedures, and execution. Page 11, line 14 would be a reporting requirement that each local government must make to really whoever the select committee decides that report should be made, if a report is even needed. But that report must include at a minimum the amount of funds that are invested in stocks and equities, including new amounts from the immediately past fiscal year, the type of investments that are made or held by the local government, including the duration and mix, the amount of earnings or losses under this section, and then the costs that are incurred by the local government in making or managing these investments under this section. There was the staff comment on page 12, there was discussion regarding whether there should be an audit requirement, and if so, what that should look like. So that was another point of discussion. And then the last part of this section concerns the Meyer rule, basically. It basically brings that language in for how the local government must treat earnings and losses. And that is the language on page 1 and just follows basically the language that we currently have in 94108. And then, Mr. Chairman, this would be effective July 1, 2025. And I would be happy to answer questions.
Representative Larson, sorry, I was taking notes there.
Just a question to you. Do you want to go through both these bills before we start chewing the fat off them, or what would you?
I think we will. I think we'll have Brian give us a summary on the next bill, then we'll probably take a little public comment and sort of have a back and forth working as we proceed. So unless there's direct questions from the committee at this time on LSO 125.
Oh, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Representative Storer has her hand up.
Representative Storer, we'll go to you, and then I'll come back to you, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Chairman Walters. I have a question on Romanet 4 on the top of page 5 of 25 LSO 0125, where it states that each investment under this section should be a duration of not less than 5 years. This is referring to the equity holdings. So one question is just, I want to understand the reasoning behind that. And then I guess my question is also, let's say a local government is invested in an equity fund, for example, which would probably make sense. Then you have underlying holdings within that fund that probably could not be subject to such a rule as this, because they're not, they may not be held, and the manager of the fund would determine the duration So I'm just curious what the thinking is behind this.
Yeah.
Brian?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, in terms of just the underlying idea, my recollection from June was there needed to be some set time specified to ensure that, basically to help, minimize losses, that they are not placed in and then pulled out too quickly, was a discussion that there needed to be a recognition that these are illiquid type of investments that needed to be held for a while. The 5 years, I think, was something that was just thrown out, certainly a placeholder. And then, Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, in terms of that language, certainly I think that's just a first crack at it and could, certainly benefit from, further, further tweaks to account maybe for different situations.
Representative Storr, follow up to that?
No, thank you. That's fine.
Okay, great. Representative Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think, if I may, to Representative Storr's question, that issue was brought up with the investment in Wildstar from the Treasurer's Office, where we had some of the locals that were investing, but then wanting to use it like a checkbook and do an early withdrawal, and it was very problematic. And so I think we were just trying to establish a longer length of time there, not knowing what that length of time should be. But I think that was the genesis. Mr. Chairman, my question to Brian is on the staff comment on page 8, where he talks about the number of members set, and we have a minimum and maximum in the staff comment, but in the bill draft, we only have a minimum amount. What have we have you seen other places where we set the maximum amount, Brian, or could we just go with this?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I'm not sure there was any real magic with how that was drafted, more just a starting point than anything.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, any further questions on LSO 125? No hands on the screen. Okay, we'll go to LSO 126 and have Brian walk through that. Then, as I said, we'll come back and we'll work both of these. We'll take public comment on both of these and try and fill in some of the blanks that are there. And the goal, I think, committee, is to fill in some of these blanks, continue to refine, and then move them on to our October 26th, is it, I believe?
Yeah, 30th, I think.
October 30th, meeting for more of a final vote and a final consideration at that time. So hopefully we can fill in a lot of the blanks that Brian brought up in 125 and that we'll see again here in 126. So Brian, with that, proceed to LSO 0126.
Yeah. And Mr. Chairman, just one more point to add to Representative Larson's question. This next draft may present a slightly different model in terms of setting up, a board. Because it's based on the local government liability pool, and I'll get to that in a moment. So 25 LSO 126, draft 0.5, this is 2-02 in the online meeting materials. This bill draft is based on the information that the County Commissioners Association provided. That kind of one-page handout forms the basis of this bill. This would authorize local governments to form a pool for purposes of investing local government funds in stocks and equities. The structure is, as I just mentioned, loosely based on the local government liability pool program. It would require each pool to create an investment advisory committee and a board to oversee the investment of these funds, pretty similar to the IFC. So the staff comment, page 2, once again, just like the first bill, this would require a 2/3 vote of each house voting separately for enactment. So moving on to page 3, definitions. There's a definition of board to just mean the pool joint powers board that would be formed under this article. Investment advisory committee would be the committee created. And then the same idea for local government and political subdivision as the previous draft. So the starting point, I just basically copied the language from section 6A2C here. And then the definition of political subdivision would be another point of discussion for the committee. That's the language on page, or the staff comment, on page 4. Then page 4, line 23. This would create the local government equity investment pool program to provide a mechanism for local governments to invest in stocks and equities. This language is pretty similar to 142-202A, which created the local government liability program in terms of that intent statement that begins on line 26. Then moving on to page 5, the staff comment, the LGLP statutes are pretty much silent when it comes to the composition of that board, how that's determined, the terms of the board members, the qualifications or makeup of the board members. Statute says nothing about that. That is all established by rule of that joint powers board when those first local governments formed the LGLP. So that would be, I think, the first question for the committee here is for this board, how is that determined? I just kind of started with a placeholder that I'll go through in a minute. So page 5, line 37, the board consists of a number of members as determined by the participating local governments and must include members from the different types of local governments. Page 6, line 6 are the duties of the board. They must administer the pool, consult with and receive advice from the investment advisory committee that's created in this article, and then establish assessments and fees for participating local governments to operate the pool. This language on page 6, line 14 in that paragraph 3 is loosely based on language that's used in the LGLP. So that pool can assess its local members to basically fund the operation of that program. Page 6, line 20 would authorize the collection of those assessments by the pool, and then the board would adopt rules governing the administration of the pool. Then page 7, line 4 are duties that are more focused on investments. So in consultation with the investment advisory committee, the pool board must establish procedures for the investment of the participating government's funds in appropriate asset classes and including equities and stocks. Those procedures must include, question.
Go ahead and finish your sentence.
Yep, so it must include investments made with a person who is registered if required and then has a physical office in Wyoming.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian, I just was curious if you had contemplated or discussed with LSO staff on the board members. So it appears that every entity that has an investment would then have a position on the board, right? So, well, it says board members shall have and shall include members from the different types of local governments.
Yep. So
clarify then that for me, make sure we're on the same page.
Yep. So Mr. Chairman, that sentence, and this is the top of page 6, line 1, pretty there'd be a school district member of that board is the intent. I don't think the intent is if there are 37 local governments in the pool, the board would be 37 members.
Very good. Thank you. I'm good.
Okay, proceed, Brian.
Yep. So now, Mr. Chairman, on the top of page 8, these are requirements for the board in consultation with the Investment Advisory Committee. A similar statement that the investments made in stocks and equities are for a duration of not less than 5 years. Funds provided for the investment shall not exceed the amount specified in subsection D, so a similar concept to the previous bill. The board must provide procedures for monitoring, controlling, depositing, and retaining of investments, providing for agreements that would be made between the pool and a person to invest those funds, and then for implementing investment policy statements for those investments, as well as standards for competitive bidding to select a person to serve as the investment manager. I'm on the top of page 9 now. Then, Mr. Chairman, the board would be required to establish a process by which participating local governments would enter into an agreement with the board for participation in the pool. The requirements would include how funds may be transferred or deposited to the pool, how they may be withdrawn, including limitations on withdrawal and penalties for any early withdrawal of funds from the pool, and then ensuring that funds that are provided may be invested to meet the investment objectives that are specified here. The board, on the bottom of page 9, line 22, must establish procedures for calculating and disposing of earnings, including how they're apportioned to each participating local government, and how those earnings are deposited with or transferred to each participating local government. Then page 10, line 6, again, similar to 125. These are limitations on the amount of funds and the type of funds that local governments could provide, basically identical to 125. So in excess of a certain dollar amount, or again, could be a percentage of funds that exceed, that are in excess of the operating budget, or funds that have been held in reserves for a certain period of time. Page 10, line 18, this subsection is loosely based on language for the local government liability program. The board can deny participation in or can terminate a local government's participation in the program for a failure to pay any required assessments or for the early withdrawal of funds from the pool. Then page 11, line 4 is the Meyer rule from 94108. Basically, a couple of tweaks, but generally identical to that concept. Then moving on to page 12, this is a section that would create the Investment Advisory Committee for the local government equity investment pool. Most of this language is taken from the IFC statutes. Basically, as a placeholder, the committee could decide how to set that up, or if they, whether to set one up at all is within the committee's purview. So this Investment Advisory Committee would have 7 voting members. The next sentence, this is page 12, line 25, taken from the IFC statutes. I just highlighted in terms of whether it's necessary, but it would include the CIO of the State Treasurer's Office and the retirement system as ex officio members. And that would be, I think, another decision point for the committee. Then the top of page 13 would set 3-year terms. There's a sentence added in there for the initial terms to stagger those. So there would be 3 serving 3-year terms, 2 serving 2-year terms, and 2 serving a 1-year term. Voting members would be eligible for reappointment. And then the remainder of the language, again, identical to the IFC, terms commence on March 1, provides for the removal and provides for filling for vacancies. Page 13, line 18, this committee would select a chairman from among its members, hold 4 regular meetings, and can have special meetings as called by the board or a majority. Page 14, line 5, provides how the board, the pool board would appoint members of this investment advisory committee. So each member of the board would appoint 1 member to this committee. If there are more than 7 board members, then each member is selected by a majority vote of the entire board. If there are less than 7 board members, then this is the bottom of page 14. Each member would appoint their 1 member, and then the remaining members would be by majority vote of the investment advisory committee. Again, all of this is just placeholder language as a starting point. The bottom of page 14, the top of page 15 are the qualifications, and these are taken from the IFC. So 7 years of institutional investment experience with at least a $500 million portfolio, broad understanding of financial markets, no felony or conviction or no contest plea, no disciplinary action subject to moral turpitude, and no conflicts of interest. The Investment Advisory Committee would be required to, page 15, line 19, they would be required to develop, recommend and review investment policy statements and procedures for the pool, recommend any modifications. They would consult with the board as required regarding the establishment and execution of investments. And then they would be, this committee would be required to report to the select committee, so this entity, not less than 1 time a year on the investment policies. Liability of the Investment Advisory Committee members would be governed by 123-107. That's the staff comment on the bottom of page 16. That language is taken from the LGLP program and just basically provides that the individual members are not individually liable for the board's actions, inactions, or omissions. Effective July 1, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer questions.
Representative Larson.
I apologize for all my questions, Mr. Chairman, but I was hoping maybe we could go back to page 10, Brian. And down on the bottom of page 10 on line 22, where it talks about the failure to pay assessments required by this article. In the previous bill, we had a different term used there. And so my question was, if the assessments contemplated here would include managerial fees and then perhaps also administrative assessment because you've got a collective, am I seeing that fair? Or?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, those would be, that's correct. Those are the two items that I think the board would assess fees from each participating local government.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Brian, question, because I don't have it memorized, the local government liability pool board members, how are they compensated? Are they paid at the same level? Because this largely mirrors that. Are they paid at the same level as legislators for days that they work plus per diem, or are they just paid per diem? As I look at the task of setting all this up, it seems like that's maybe insufficient for what we would be asking of this board, at least initially.
Yep. So, Mr. Chairman, if you give me 2 minutes, I'll get you an answer to that.
Okay, thank you. No rush on that. Other questions from the committee on 0126? Okay. Well, as I said, I think we'll work both of these somewhat together, but we'll flip back to 125. We'll start with 125. And I think the best way to do this is maybe just a little public comment, and then we'll leave the public comment somewhat open as we work the bill so that we can engage with the public and try and fill in some of these blanks. So we're on 125, knowing that some of these comments may apply to 126, and you can say this would also be in 126, so we don't have to recover it here when we get to 126. But we'll start with a little public comment and start with Jeremiah. You're on the end of the table, or however you guys want. I'm guessing you've spoken to one another and have a plan of attack, so go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Ashley Harpstreet. I'm the new Executive Director for Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I stand here before you today to encourage you to move both these concepts forward. This is something we're very interested in moving for the ability of our communities to best use taxpayer dollars. As we know, with state resources, 30% of our investment revenue pays for a lot of our services. And when we find ourselves in special situations, it would be nice to have the same ability at the local level. We have a bunch of examples we're going to provide. City of Casper will be following our testimony that can very much speak clearly to some relevant examples. But as far as both the bills go, we think both the bones are here. However, we're asking for more time, which it sounds like we hopefully will get to sit down and work with the Treasurer's Office and work with all of our colleagues as we think through some of these contemplations that we're going to present to you today. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. I want to thank you for considering these two pieces of legislation, and I really want to compliment your staff who have done a tremendous job of putting together a strong structure in both of these models. I went through our document that we shared with you at the last meeting, and as you would expect, Mr. Fuller checked all of the boxes there. There are certainly some placeholders here that I think we need additional expertise to help us understand what those provisions should be. You're part of that expertise. Certainly the State Treasurer's Office is part of that, and they've been very helpful in offering their assistance in putting that together. Mr. Chairman, I might just offer a few comments relative to each of the bills, starting with 125. And there's been a little bit of conversation this morning about the 5-year provision that appears on page 5 and also appears in the other piece of legislation. We strongly support that. As the Treasurer's Office mentioned, the 5-year component. In my testimony at the last meeting, I indicated that we've had internal conversations that there should be perhaps maybe different timeframes. Certain investments might have a 5-year timeframe associated with a specific dollar amount that they would put in, and others may have a 20-year horizon. I think having that provision is one of the best safeguards that we can have in this legislation, because as you all know, time is our best friend in these sorts of investments, and so we are supportive of that 5-year provision and wouldn't suggest going any lower. Mr. Chairman, as it relates to some of the placeholders, and I'm going to go to the provisions on page 7, I don't have for you exactly what this model should look like. I am concerned about the 2 paragraphs that are here. I understand why they were put forward, but I'll take each of them in turn, and I'll start with provision A at line 7. It talks about a dollar amount in excess of a local government's operating budget. If we're going to keep a provision like that, I think it's probably more appropriate that we look at a percentage rather than a dollar figure, because all local governments are different. If you're looking at provision B on line 7, I don't know where this provision comes from or if it's necessary. I'm a little concerned. As you know, Natrona County, when they sold their hospital, came into a significant amount of additional funding. Why would we limit them and say you have to keep it in reserve for a number of years and not take advantage of an opportunity to really spend some larger investment? So I think we need to take a longer look at that particular provision. As it relates to these provisions, I heard Colorado and Kentucky mentioned. If you look at least the way I understand Kentucky's model, it's based off of percentages of their overall reserves. It's not of their operating budget and putting limitations around that. So in any regard, again, I don't have specifics for you on how we might fix that, but I think there are great experts, you among them, that could help us with that. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, in terms of this legislation, I'm going to just point to page 12 and in particular provision 3 on line 6. First off, we're perfectly fine with the notion that we would have to report this sort of thing. I think there are many reports that local governments submit, the cost of government report being one example that's submitted to the Department of Audit as maybe one mechanism. But the thing that caught my attention there, and it's addressed elsewhere in both of these pieces of legislation, is it mentions reporting on the amount of earnings and losses. Seems to me it's maybe more appropriate that we report on the realized earnings and losses, because things happen year over year within accounts, but you didn't actually liquidate it. So is that an appropriate, or is that a necessary sort of reporting provision? So maybe we want to put in realized there. Mr. Chairman, just quickly on 126.
Hold you up.
sure.
We're going to try and stick to just 120.
Okay, yep.
And unless the comments are the same, if you're saying, hey, it should be a period of 5 years in both or a period of 10 years in both. Otherwise, I'd like to stick to 125 so we don't totally lose our focus and end up off in the weeds too far. So Representative Larson.
Thank you, Jeremiah. On page 7 on that reserves amount, I think the intent of B is to try and help preserve the liquidity of the local governments to that point. But your point is fair. If we had a subsection C or some additional language that said that allowed for the investment of excess funds that come into a government from sale of properties, yada, 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 explain something to that effect, would that kind of resolve that's confirmed that is not necessary for budgetary requirements, something?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think you're working along a good path for us in
Mr.
resolving my
Chairman.
issue there.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, when we talked about, one of the theories about this in the beginning was, to take, and I know counties necessarily don't do this, as I look at Ashley, like a sewer sinking fund, which may be larger in percentage and dollar amount to the regular budget, but is sitting there that's specific, that can't be touched for any other purpose if you, especially if you work through the federal government the first time to get that money. But a fund that isn't going to be used for something else, that you can't do that. So you could use that. So you could use that and put that in this investment vehicle because you're not going to need it for a long period of time. So how do you try to, have any ideas on how you try to parse that out into a percentage or a dollar amount that doesn't actually kind of cripple you back on the other way? Because you may have a very small budget in some of our smaller communities, but may have a substantial amount in this sinking fund. Does it get the point?
Yep.
on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, I'm very pleased that you brought this up because it's actually something that Ashley and Dustin and I talked about earlier this week. Let's assume you had an initiative, a proposition that was put before the voters, and you were very explicit that you were going to collect this money and put it in reserve in this manner. Why would you say you have to hold it for a period of time before you could do what you told the voters you were going to do and they said was okay? So I think trying to address that, trying to look at the way that Representative Larson is addressing the issue that I saw there, or that we saw.
So Jeremiah, following up in that same line of reasoning, do we need a subsection in here that says if this funding was created by a proposition of the voters, then 100% of that amount could be invested in equities because it's for that sole purpose versus, because we do have the provision there in page 7, Romanet 2, basically saying, if you have $100, we don't want you to put all $100 in equities. We want you to put something in something more conservative than equities. But in this case, as we're discussing that sinking fund for sewer, water, whatever it may be, is there value in saying more of that, a higher percentage of that, or even all of it could go into these equities? But it's known that it's only for that purpose. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think we would support that. Maybe we need to make it explicit that it has to have been cast that way in terms of the proposition so that there's no hiding the cards and then we just did this. But yes, we would, I think, support a provision like that.
Okay. Brian, I'm guessing you took a little note on that. I see you over there diligently working. Thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Justin Schilling with the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I brought up in the June meeting the Powell example where they have a $3 million endowment set aside for maintenance and upkeep of their city pool. And again, that was voter approved and that was the proposition that was put to the voters, was to raise not only the monies for the pool, but also for that extra endowment. I would think that, I don't think that the voters would necessarily, I don't think we would ever put it to the voters that, hey, we're gonna build up a $3 million endowment and we're gonna invest all of it in equities. I think we would want to still kind of follow the prescribed percentages that are elsewhere in this bill, where you say this is your, that we put aside that $3 million, this percentage of that would be in equities, the other would be in more conservative investment models. So it would be kind of a little bit of a cocktail in your investment portfolio, just like the state has, just like, we've proposed, whether it's the WildStar 3, for our city, for the other types of savings and investment opportunities. But I don't think we would ever put it to the voters that, hey, we're going to ask for this extra money and we want to gamble all of it in the stock market, so.
Very good. Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for any and all. When you contemplated this bill, and it talks about setting up little IFCs and groups for each entity, for each, in each locality, whether it's a county, city, or even a special district. as a former councilman and commissioner, I know how hard it was to get people to serve on the, fair board. We're talking about a lot of firepower to be put all around the state. And as I see the good treasurer, welcome, Treasurer Meyer, the difficulties that even the office has in getting the expertise they need. Did you all discuss that at all about, that we might be setting up something here? I mean, we're kind of like a little less government. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but, but I do. So what did you all contemplate on that?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, that's a great question as well. And one point that we had noted was on page 9, talking about the advisory committee. And I would say it's a theme throughout, is just flexibility to address that. And so we talked about in page 9, line 17 in A, looking at a collective number of years of institutional investments to meet that criteria for those smaller communities to leverage. Being someone that administered a small town lodging board, I remember getting gas station owners to serve on that board that we deemed as tourism. So I completely sympathize with that point, and we want to make sure it's best set up to administer something so complex.
Okay, further questions, further comments from our esteemed panel in front of us? Senator Hicks, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so when we look at setting up the investment funds committee for these local advisory committees, so how do you do the compliance checking, and who does the compliance checking? So, when it basically infers you have to have some little background check on somebody to make sure they weren't convicted of any felonies. Who does that, and who's periodically going to check in to make sure that these local governments are meeting all these criteria for their, I'm just worried about the what I would say, I don't want to say enforcement mechanism, but where's the compliance mechanism to make sure that local governments compliant with all of these provisions underneath the statute for these investment committees? Who's going to do that?
Justin?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, as far as the criminal background checks, our municipalities do criminal background checks for employees, obviously. I've served as a youth sports coach for Cheyenne Recreation. You have to go through a criminal background check for that. That's administered by the city. I would assume that they could then provide that, have that documentation available for audit, for those folks. On the financial components of that and, kind of number of dollars under management, that might be a trickier proposition. That's not necessarily something that we do now. But I think the criminal background check part of it is definitely something that's in our wheelhouse.
So, number one, you're not employees, so I don't think you have the legal authority to go in and tell somebody you're going to run a criminal background check on them unless they agreed that you could. That would be one thing on somebody. I just look at again, my concern is we set up an investment funds committee. We go through a pretty rigorous process with the state of Wyoming, and I don't see any compliance in here. That what constitutes a broad understanding of financial markets is because I've worked for a certain investment firm for 3 years or 5 years. I'm worried about the actual setting these up and then making sure it meets the intent of the legislation, and then who has the authority to do it. And the way I would read it, I'm assuming it's just a local responsibility, but there's no compliance. There's no mechanism for compliance. So I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are on how do you make sure that these local, and periodically you need this investment advisors turn over, go in there and do routine compliance checks. So how do we do that?
Jeremiah?
Mr. Chairman, certainly 125 contemplates or sort of puts that responsibility back to the local government, no doubt. That's the way I would review it. I think this advisory committee came out of the example from here in the city of Casper and what they presented to you at the last meeting. To address this concept is the reason that I brought 126, because I had a belief that if we put local governments together under a structure similar to the LGLP, that there would be an elevated responsibility there to do those background checks, that compliance, specifically with the advisor, with the board that is established through that mechanism. Adding the advisory component is another element that was added to that I'm not opposed to. But really, 126 was the attempt to try and do that on the front end with the structure that was ultimately set up so that it wasn't one government operating on its own, that it was a collective, that we were working together and being better stewards, or at least more thoughtful about how we do things. I hope that helps. This is perhaps a place we could work harder to try and shore things up and come back with a better recommendation on what the compliance elements are.
Yeah, and so, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, if I may, that makes exact sense to me, because I'm looking at this and saying, we're gonna have 20 different investment funds committees around the state of Wyoming, operating independently with no consistency and periodic, compliance checks to make sure that the members meet all these. I just don't see the workability in 125 associated with, maybe we just get rid of these advisory committees completely, because I'm not sure that they really serve the purposes of what they were set up to be. We won't never know. With 20 different committees set up around the local committees set up, if they're even consistently operating with what the intent of the framework of the statute is. And so, again, I would concur with that 126 has one uniform application across the state of Wyoming, which makes a lot more sense to me than having a whole bunch of little independent advisory committees all over the state of Wyoming going different directions. Anyway, that's just my thoughts, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Liz, I see you have your hand up, so I'll go to you, and then I have Representative Larson and Senator Guru next. So go ahead, Liz.
Thank you, Chairman Walters. The number of financial managers and retired financial managers in Teton County with second homes notwithstanding, I guess I would also like to echo the concerns Senator Gru and Senator Hicks have brought up. And to that end, just in terms of the capacity of our communities to actually be able to provide the oversight and expertise and the compliance needs and auditing needs, I think. I'm just curious, what is the appetite out there among the communities? Are we just trying to address this for Casper or some of the larger communities around the state? Or is this something that you all envision smaller communities or entities would also be interested in? I'm just trying to get a sense of that. Thanks.
Ashley?
Mr. Chairman, hello, Representative Storr, Ashley Herbstreit here. I think that's a valid question, as we know that there will be a small percentage that would use this option. However, I do think City of Casper has some relevant thoughts and ideas and examples that will be after us, that will get a little more into the weeds of this and could be a good model to think about replicating for the other communities that do sign up for this. And again, this is why we're urging for a little bit more time. This was a template that was put in, and where we need to consult with some others and think through this. Thank you.
Okay. Follow up, Representative Storr?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious whether you have I know LSO has been helping with this. Have you run these past some real expertise in the investment management world to kind of gut check, whether this makes sense or not?
Jeremiah?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, good morning. In our case, I've consulted, the draft that I provided you, the one pager that I provided to you was provided to at least 2 large public investment firms in the state of Wyoming to gather their feedback to hopefully inform what was provided there. And they did provide some feedback. They certainly thought that it was appropriate to have brick and mortar presence in the state of Wyoming. They have thoughts on which of the models they might prefer to work. I'll leave that to them to discuss, but at least in our case, I did run this by at least two. I think the two largest public investment firms in the state of Wyoming for their feedback.
Just a final
Follow-up.
observation, if I may. Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Representative Storr.
thank you. I guess I would also talk to people outside of the state. So I think it's probably not surprising that someone in the state would support the idea of brick and mortar within the state, but whether that's really necessary, I think you might get some different answers outside. Thanks.
And Mr. Chairman, I didn't consult other investment firms outside of the state of Wyoming, but I did consult my colleagues from across the country to understand which of their states are operating in this space. And at least one of my counterparts is operating their public equities fund along with their municipal association. And they were very helpful in helping me build out the framework that I ultimately presented to you.
Mr. Chairman?
I'll get to you, Senator Hicks. Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I kind of following up on this conversation we've been having, I think that if I read this, it's noteworthy to say that the investment fund committee individuals don't have to be from the municipality or the county. Similar to the state's investment fund committee, they can have expertise in living someplace else if they just agree to do that. But I agree that we have to have a mechanism or a box to check that validates they have the credentials that allow them to make the decisions that I think that and concerns that Representative Storr. So I'd be interested. I know we're getting there, but am I understanding that you have flexibility in selecting the investment committee, and that was your desire, but you too share the concern that we maybe need to file some more of the rust off this thing?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yeah, we certainly need to continue filing on this a little bit. And I want to be clear, I think that the advisory committee is flexible. It could be somebody from well beyond Wyoming's borders. The brick and mortar reference is simply to the companies that you use as the investment mechanism, not necessarily who is on that advisory committee.
Senator Grew?
Yeah,
Do you still have a question?
Yeah,
or
well,
did it
just a comment, yeah, because we don't, yeah, the point is, I don't want to, by saying that, I don't want anyone out there to think, well, boy, they're just Xing out all the little towns, because we're not. Probably the person or people that have the most expertise in those towns are going to be the folks that are applying to do the work. And so then we kind of get into this whole, who's watching who. So that was the point about, yeah, maybe having a larger one group that could do it and not have all that many layers to try to figure out. So thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so this question would be for both Jeremiah and Brian. And so there's been a number of reference to other states that allow local governments to invest in equities. My question is did we look in there, in those cases, do they also allow those local governments through their state treasurer's office to invest like we do with the WildStar funds? And so my guess is, and I'm just speculating here, the reason that they allow local governments to invest in equities is because they have no other mechanism for investment. I don't know that, but the question is we have the option already now that local governments can invest through the state treasurer's office through some of those funds. Is the reason that some of these states allow local governments to invest in equities is because that mechanism doesn't exist in those states, and that's the question. And Brian, so when you went through and looked at those, was there any analysis to look to see if there was other options for those local governments or not?
Jeremiah? Ashley, anyone have a response to that question? Or
Mr. Chairman, Catherine Camerati at LSO Budget Fiscal. Good morning. Chairman Hicks, when we went through that analysis, we specifically only looked at the mechanisms regarding around local investing in a pool. And specifically in equities as well. It did not appear in our review or any other review that we performed that there were any other mechanisms for local governments to invest unless they were invested with the state treasurer.
And
Follow up.
Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman,
Brad.
I would just add, when I looked through the statute, I mean, my search was focused entirely on, I think the topic here was, direct investment by local governments in equities. So I didn't look to see if, the reason they had that is because they didn't have a statewide type of option.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's an important thing that we would need to look at going forward is if in fact this is going on, is it because it's strictly limited, that there's no other options for local governments? But it's just a question that I think that I'd see if we could find out. If we move this stuff forward, I'd like to know the answer to that question.
Question for Jeremiah and Ashley. If we were to delete the section about creating what I'm going to call the IFC-like committee so that every small community doesn't have to find it, but then put in some provisions saying any investment manager that you utilize must have minimum 10 years experience, 250 million under management, so that you're using a high qualified investment management team, firm, or individual versus, would that, in this draft, we're only talking here in 125, would that somewhat alleviate some of the concerns? And some of the concerns I think Senator Hicks brings up to where we don't have 25 or 30 different IFC-like committees around the state that aren't necessarily consistent, that don't have, there's no one really for accountability, but it would be the local government is not following statute if they aren't choosing a manager that meets criteria that we just put that criteria in. Would that be a simpler way of going about it here in 125? And I know I just threw this on you, so you don't have a lot of time to think about it, but.
Mr. Chairman, my initial reaction is that I think we would look favorably to that, and I don't think it'd be inconsistent with even provisions that I suggested should be in option 2 or the other bill in my last testimony to you.
Okay. Justin?
I think the idea of the IFCs though too is to have kind of multiple minds or kind of put your heads together type of scenario. So that's the one thing I guess I would contemplate there, because the way I understand it in the Casper example, that IFC, they meet, they contemplate the city's options when it comes to investment, and then they make recommendations to the governing body. And the governing body has the kind of the final say. So if you were going to cut that IFC out, that independent investment advisor, would they still just be making recommendations to the governing body? The governing body would take that under consideration and then make the decision. It would change the structure of that, I think, just a little bit. So that would be one thing to consider, I think. The one thing, just as we're talking and kind of thinking this through as we've had this discussion, obviously the second bill contemplates one centralized IFC for the pool. In this first bill, I could almost see an option to do something similar, where you would have one centralized IFC that these individual, that basically, because we're not going to have many communities. As Senator Hicks alluded to, this is going to be in the dozens at most that would be looking to take advantage of this. So could you have one centralized IFC, whether that was something that, our associations maybe put together, that vetted those different investment proposals from the different communities, or just kind of looked at each community's individual situation and made recommendations back to those governing bodies. I think it would be easier to gather up one committee with that expertise. And of course, it would also cut down on what Senator Grew talked about, where if you're trying to gather that up in your own committee, those are probably the people you want to do business with, if they're any good anyway. So you wouldn't want them on your committee, you'd want them in your Rolodex, so.
Ashley?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Senator Hicks, I think what my colleague here says is a very good idea, but I also would plea to you that this is day 4 on the job. And I think it would be best to survey our membership and get some information and get back to you on that, and survey Jeremiah's and see what the collective thought is. I do like these suggestions we're building as we're flying the plane. I also think City of Casper has some structure that's going to provide relevant examples and a good gold standard to think about as well. So I think it's a little too soon for us to tell, and the other reason we're asking for more time.
Okay, sounds good.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead,
if
Jeremiah.
I can, I referenced my last document. If you don't have a copy of that, it's bullet point 5 under option 2 that I gave you that sort of speaks to this. And what I had put there is the notion that there needed to be standards for competitive bidding and qualifications for the firms which you might do business with, including things like creditworthiness, experience, capitalization, size, and it goes on a little bit more there. I'll also say, and I have just a note here that says Kentucky has a provision similar to this in its statute that requires firms to be overseen by a federal regulatory agency, which would go beyond what you have in here. I don't know if that's appropriate, but it is part of that trying to get at the right firms, not necessarily have to have an advisory committee.
Okay. Liz, did I see you raising your hand? Representative Storer, excuse me. There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think actually I didn't have it up, but you were reading my mind. I would just, couple thoughts. One, Wyoming is a state with 580,000 people, as compared to Kentucky with I think 4.5 million or something like that. So we know that it's not easy to really build out these volunteer efforts in some places, I think, to Senator Gru's point. So I'm just a little bit skeptical of the idea that we would want to be setting up a number of these around the state. I do think getting some additional thought into this process from some investment experts that can really think about, what are you trying to do? What are the kind of, you can pool funds with different asset allocations, invest them together, and still meet the goals of different organizations, different entities, I think, just by adjusting the different asset allocations that they may use. There are ways to do that. And I just think that just my preference right now is to think about how to do that, just because it seems just more practical for a state like Wyoming to pursue that. So that's my only comment. I'm happy to move forward with both these ideas, but really would like to see some additional thought coming in from folks that actually do this for a living. Thanks.
Excuse me, Treasurer Meyer, I see you in the audience. Anything you want to add right now, or are you just listening at this time? And then we'll get to the City of Casper.
A couple of things there. I hope you don't get prescriptive in what, if you're going to have a pool and maybe look at some of the things that we've done in our office and use reference portfolios, rather than saying you can have this many stocks and things like that. And I think that a great deal of education has to be put in place, especially in the area of liquidity. And you've got, as Senator Guru made note of, is that you have these sinking funds, and they could be there for 20, 30 years or something like that. But if you put everything in equities and you have a severe downturn, you don't have any dry powder to actually buy in when the market's low. So as far as modern portfolio construction, you necessarily can't put that into a bill, but I think you can put sideboards around it. WRS is going to hate this thing that I'm going to tell you now, but if you look at their 457 plan, individuals have a wide variety. I think it's probably around 8 of different types of classes and risks that you can put in there. And they're basically ETFs. And I think that if you wanted to use the cheapest way would be to use Vanguard or State Street and I don't even like saying this, BlackRock. They have those different type of life path plans, but you can mix and match them any way you want to. It's a cheap way to get exposure into basically all asset classes. I think that if you put and you have to look at the time frame. If that doesn't have any private assets in there at all, I hesitate to even think that cities and towns or counties would contemplate using private equity, private credit, or venture capital in these things, because even though they're an attractive mechanism for professional investors, they don't understand duration in the bond market. So I don't think they could understand the liquidity risk and the haircuts you get if you want to do something. Even professionals like Harvard and Yale, they came into a problem where they had liquidity, and their privates had a haircut of 25 to 40% when they sold them because they needed the money. And I doubt if the citizens would really like them to get into that, but that might be something where, even some of the local people on the streets could actually figure out putting together a mix of different equities using ETFs, and then keeping in mind that you want to have some things in your other tranche, but at the same time, if they have WildStar 1 or 2, then they can have some dry powder there to a certain extent if they want to take that out and put that in the other tranche. So, there are some optionalities, I think, that are set up. And I think there's some, I guess I would say that if you really want to get some experts involved, I would probably hire Makita, who's WRS or RVK, to actually do some stress tests on some of the things that they're looking at, because they can go in there and say, well, what did this particular portfolio did during the great financial crisis, during the COVID thing, any of these recessions that we've had in the last 20 years. And they actually, and WRS uses that, Makita does it, they know exactly how to set that up. And then you know whether you're getting over your skis or not, and you know what you can actually rely on. Because I'd hate to have a sinking fund and it's supposed to, basically replace whatever utility is out there that's going to be gone in 30 years. And they don't understand that. And in the last 5 years, they lose half of it. You don't have time to basically recoup it by the time that the money's needed. So there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts in this thing. And I would say that I think there's some good conversation that I heard today. And I think if you're going to have folks that aren't like a Casper or something, or the other counties that have hundreds of millions of dollars get into it, and they want to get a little bit in there, I think it's probably better for them to have the same type of option that maybe a retiree has in a 457 plan, but understand that there should be some sideboards on it. And I think reference portfolios give you more. They give you two things. They give you protection about the amount of risk that you're going to get, but they also give you some flexibility in what you can invest in to a certain degree. So there are some things that I would say that would be on the do not invest list, and those would be your private equity, private credit, and venture capital. Just because from my perspective, I think these guys would get in big trouble moving down those roads. There's something that I wish that I necessarily had in my IFC. We really have a cumbersome way to, if we have a member that's not showing up to meetings or acting counterproductively, put in some way that's, basically objective, to be able to remove those folks from this IFC. Because you may have some people that say, yeah, great, I can do this, their life changes and they don't show up, and then you got a problem. So, and those are things that like performance or actions that they take that cost the municipalities money or loss opportunities or something, but make it so it's really, right out there, black and white, so there's no subjective thing. I just don't like how Bob eats his Cheetos at the meeting, whatever, how that is, because things like that get out of hand and they're not healthy in investing. So I guess those are some of the things that I see that might kind of solve the solution to the extent get some of the people on Main Street involved in it, but give them sideboards and, those ETFs, you're 10 basis points down to 2 basis points. So we shouldn't have these guys going to Main Street and getting dinged 50 basis points for their management. That just doesn't seem, that takes all the fun out of it, if you pay all those fees. So, there's some things that I think that could be done, but I'd really suggest hiring Makita or RBK. I think Makita knows a lot more about these different types of things and work more with retirement. RBK, I think they do everything there, but I know that Makita does a good job for WRS. So that's I'm saying, get the professionals to take off on everything that was talked about today and see if they are actually advisors to, some of these plans out there, because they'll give you the straight scoop.
Very good. Questions for Treasurer Meyer? Senator Hicks?
So, Mr. Chairman, Treasurer Meyer, what would it take for your office to set up, let's call it WIO Star 4 with a heavy emphasis and asset allocation towards equities that would allow local governments to invest in with a longer duration period?
Well, I think that in WIO Star 3, the way we're setting it up right now, what we're looking at is having interactive brokers do separately funds for every entity. So if Casper was in there, they would have basically an interactive broker fund. It would be a S&P 500 ETF. And so they'd be investing in the 500 largest companies in the United States. And I know that is about three basis points for just the ETF, and then there'll be some accounting fees, I'm sure, with the interactive brokers, but we haven't got that sorted out yet.
So,
but they could
Mr.
leave that in there forever if they wanted to, and just let it compound if they wanted to, and just let it continue to grow. So, there's no.
So back to your example of WRS with their 457B program under WIO Star 3, you would have a number of options you could choose.
Yeah,
in different
that's not how
asset
we've set it up.
allocations or not?
Yeah, we haven't set it up like that because we don't have, I guess if we were going to do that, we would have to hire Makita or somebody to say, okay, how does this accounting work? Because I know they have separate accounts for every individual, and I think that is actually handled by whether it's Vanguard or BlackRock. I don't believe that the WRS does that in-house accounting. That's all out. And that's relatively a fairly low load instrument. And you can get online and see, you got, I think you got large cap, small cap, mid cap, international,
2050 Horizon
Yeah,
2035.
real estate, you know, there's, they've got a good, I guess, representation about how much each one of those different asset categories have performed over a period of time. So that's, I think that would be something that would work. What it would cost us to do, you know, that's kind of out there, but I think that we would probably do something with Get Makita. And Don and Patrick are throwing me under the bus right now as we speak, you know, because there's a lot of flexibility in the S&P 500, and you can you know, put as much money as you really want to in that, and I think that people will be able to, you know, see their daily balances on an hourly basis or whatever, you know, and they can pull it up and see what their accounts are actually doing. You know, so I think might be a good start for people to, because by the time you get through all of this, they'll be able to go ahead and get into those things, and maybe the need for more of a diversified portfolio might not be as, I guess, enticing as a person might think. But the thing that I would say before you really get moving on this, if there's any extra money in the LSO budget to have Makita or something do a plan like that, I think that would that would pay dividends. Then you're not doing, you know, one step forward and two steps back.
I can tell you there's more money in LSO's budget, so. So typically, Mr. Chairman, I mean, the way we fund a lot of these, it's basis points based on the investment returns. And so I would anticipate it's the same thing. And we've contemplated that in the bill, that there's going to be some fees charged associated with this. So it would be no different if there was a Wildstar 4 that allowed a heavy investment allocation in equities, that is still going to be run on fees.
Yeah.
It's got to pay for itself.
Yeah. On the other hand, I think, you know, it wouldn't hurt to find out what they would charge for something like that. I think it'd be $20,000 or less is what my thought would be, you know, and it might even be less than that, just because they might want to be the outside investment advisor that takes a look at it and makes sure that you have compliance and things like that, because that's probably the type of person that you'd like to have a you know, oversight in that thing. And there wouldn't be that much compliance if you had, you know, if you had outside people, or even if you had, you know, a structure set up that your folks on Main Street, your different small-time investment shops could actually do, because those are, you know, those indexes are available, and it shouldn't cost a lot of money in that regard. You know, but as far as the people on the investment board there, I think those characteristics that the chairman talked about, you know, they're not the standard that we have, but they are a fairly rigorous standard. I think there might be only one or two investment firms in the state of Wyoming that are over that 250. I know there's one in Sheridan. I think there might be one in Jackson. Well, I know there's some 1 and 2 people shop in Jackson that do some private families. There's several of those in there, but they're not, I think, open to public to the general investor. They're for institutional investing primarily. Because we did do a search about the assets under management of every investor in Wyoming on Main Street, basically. And like I say, I think there's 50 some, and really only one that could even consider being an investor for the state of Wyoming because of the statutory requirements. So, yeah, it's if you want Main Street involved, you're going to have to lower your standards quite a little bit. I think the fella in Cody is not an investment manager. I think they're an advisor, and I think their assets under management are about 90 million. So we didn't get into investment advisors. That's a different thing rather than management, so.
Very good. Thank you, Treasurer Meyer.
Okay, thanks, guys.
All right. Further public comment? And again, this is on LSO 125. We'll get to 126 here in just a short time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Kirk Schmidt. I've been here before. I retired a couple years ago. I worked 38 years in school finance, so that's my expertise. There's several concerns I have. And let me just start with the first fundamental one. Amendment A talked about allowing political subdivisions to buy equities. That was how it was sold. That's what everybody thought. These bills, right now, the way they are, and based on the conversation over the last 2 meetings, basically excludes 90% of those political subdivisions that were mentioned in Amendment A. They don't fit the criteria. Now, I don't know that there's too many people out there that realize that, but I don't think that the people would have voted for Amendment A if they would have said, oh, it's only going to be allowed for a select few. I don't think that's the way that worked. Right now, the funds you're talking about are being invested locally. They're there. They're invested by those boards, commissions, councils today. And based on the conversations I've had with several of those people, they're doing a pretty dang good job. They're accountable. They get, in some cases, they have a large amount of money, and they've hired private investment advisors to help them make those difficult decisions. And they get great advice, and they're getting great returns on their money based on what they're doing today. I'm a little concerned that now all of a sudden, because of the change in investment, that the legislature is going to take that away or be more prescriptive to those local governments. That's what I vote for my county commissioners to do. That's what I vote for my city council members to do. That's what I vote for my school board members to do. They take care of it. And they are more accountable than I think you realize. Every one of those has to go through an annual CPA audit. Including in that audit is an evaluation of their investment policies and the investments they've made over time. And I have seen reports, and you can go out on the Department of Audit's website. You can see if there were concerns about any of those boards or commissions making investments that they may not have been, that they shouldn't have been. 125 address has a couple of things in there. Okay, like I said, I spent 38 years managing investments and money for school district. Your investment committee, I wouldn't qualify. I couldn't be on there. Okay? The communities in Wyoming, how many of those people are you going to find to be on those advisory committees? But isn't that right now what the local elected officials, isn't that what they do? You heard the city of Casper has an investment advisory committee. The smaller towns, their investment advisory committee is that locally elected board or commission. That's who it is. The county treasurers, the city treasurers, that's who their advisory committee is. And like I say, if they're hiring people from outside, those people are accountable and they provide all the reports in the world. It's very concerning that now all of a sudden, those people investing those local funds, they aren't doing a good enough job. You talk about the fees, and Treasurer Meyer can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but right now on the Secretary of State's website, there are proposed changes to WildStar 1 and WildStar 2. In those changes, they're removing the cap on the fees. So there is no cap. just so you understand. I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about caps on fees and whatnot, and those locally elected boards, when they're negotiating, whether it's with their own investment advisor or whether it's whoever they're buying their investments through, they're aware what the fees are and they're right up front about it, and they understand that. And their rate of return is calculated net of those fees, so they understand completely. They're more sophisticated than you give them credit for. I'm very concerned, Mr. Chairman, about the way local control keeps eking away from everybody. The one thing that bothered me when I sat down and ran the numbers is how many people were affected by Amendment A. I mean, I was kind of shocked at the last committee meeting when those caps started coming in, because like I said, that wiped out over 90% of those people having that investment tool available to them. I mean, it took them away, took it away from them. And I don't think that was the intent of Amendment A. I sat through a lot of those meetings because I was very concerned about it. I never once heard that there were going to be that there was going to be an exclusion to that degree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Further public comment, again, we're on 125. I know the city of Casper has been anxiously awaiting to share some experience, so please come forward.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr.
Push the
Chairman.
button until the bottom turns green, just to.
There we go. I didn't push hard enough, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Brenda Janikowski, and I'm serving on the Casper Investment Advisory Committee at this time. This is Kermit Woodley. He is an associate of mine on that committee. The city of Casper did provide a letter with some comments on the 125 bill as we received the draft. And I don't know if you guys had an opportunity to review that, if you had any questions to start off with, or if you wanted us just to kind of go through what.
I think just high level, go through it, please.
Okay. So just to give you a little bit of background, we've had an investment committee in Casper for over 4 years. Our job is not to select investments. Our job is basically to provide information to the city treasurer and members of the city council on the process of selecting investment management and an appropriate approach to investing. We are not making those decisions. So I think there's been some confusion today about the role of an investment advisory committee to local governments versus the actual person doing the investing. We utilized an RFP process to choose an investment manager to manage the city's money, where we helped the city make the selection, but our job is not to actually manage the money. We also have some concerns about the 5 years, simply because we have a lot of money that is invested for much longer periods of time. We have perpetual funds, and all of that is separate from the operating budget. So depending on what parameters you choose, I would consider something other than an operating budget and maybe look more at reserves, that kind of thing. Do you have anything to add for that, Kermit?
Establishing percentages.
Oh, in our part of our RFP process to address some of the concerns, we did pay a lot of attention to fees. I do believe that some of your smaller communities would have a harder time negotiating fees, because usually your fees are based on the amount of money that is managed. The larger the pool, the larger amount of money they're managing, the less the percentage is. And I don't remember which one of you made the point, but if there's a cap, most likely the cap's going to be charged. Where if you utilize an RFP process, you are putting it out there competitively and going to get everybody's best option. We did talk about also the Investment Advisory Committee requirements. And our committee is composed of 5 members. The committee could be from 3 to 7, depending on the size of the government. And I would also encourage this to be the members of the local community, because they have an investment in that community. They have an investment in the outcome that's going to be achieved, and utilize the larger institutional type investments managers for actually managing the money. We recommended that your committee members have a certification or designation, and I listed several there that are applicable, such as CFP, CFA, CHFC, PFS, CIMA, and/or have 10 or more years of experience in portfolio management of a portfolio in excess of $110 million. This is the level at which, if you are an independent investment advisor, that you rise to the level to be managed or overseen by the SEC and not a state regulatory agency. I would propose, and I was not aware that this was in statute, that you strike the word institutional as it pertains to the Investment Advisory Committee, because in the investment world, institutional means a specific thing. It means managing money for an institution, such as a school, a city, a municipality, where you have individuals like myself that have managed money, a lot of money for individuals that would rise to a certain level, but that is not an institutional manager. But the principles for modern portfolio theory, for diversification, for asset allocation would all apply.
Okay, good, great points. I enjoyed your presentation as I was reading it prior to the meeting. I really do appreciate what you provided to the committee. Any questions for the city of Casper? Does your partner in crime have anything he'd like to add? Kermit? Mr. Willie, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Previously, there was a question regarding compliance and how we would ensure that that was happening. And that's part of the RFP process, is that we only looked at qualified investors. We only looked at ones that had brick and mortar in the state. So we can check that box pretty easily by not being the ones actually making the investment decisions, but by just being the ones who pick the advisor.
Okay. Does that help? All right. Very good. Thank you for your presentation. Please stay close, as we may have some more questions. All right. Any further public comment on 125? I think in to.
The guiding cap is in the, basically the Office of State Slip Board investment policy statement. And for the WildStar 1 and 2, it's capped at 50 basis points. So not sure which cap I'm referring to. I'll get with them and see what that is, but we can't basically deviate from the rules of the
Okay. Thank you, Treasurer. Thank you, Treasurer. So I think we'll just start on 125 here with a page turn. Sure, we'll take a 5-minute break. 5-minute break, then we'll come back and start with a page turn of 125, then we'll move to 126. A lot of our questions have already been answered on 126, so I think it'll go quite a bit quicker. But we'll move to a 5-minute break right now. Thank you. All right, folks, if we could find our seats, we'll come back to order. If we could find our seats, folks. Took a standard legislative 5-minute break that extends maybe a few minutes beyond 5 minutes as we have some sidebar conversations. With that, we'll get back to our business at hand. We are starting a page turn on draft 125, page 1 and really page 2 are staff comments, and really the boilerplate, not a whole lot there. So where we really start is on page, bottom of page 3 and really into the top of page 4. Again, this is LSO 125. We're on page 4. I'd like to work the bill and page turn work. I don't know that we need to move it because it's still under a concept at this point.
Apologize, yeah, no, have to get my petite fingers to work here. So I'd like to come back to page 3 and make a motion if I may. Are we ready to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so as I reviewed this and studied this, and we could do, this would be my motion, is that on local governments, local government means city, county, city, and town. And then we delete the rest of that line, and we would delete Romanet 2. If we agreed with that, then you would come over to page 5 and delete lines 26, 27, and 28, and on page 6, lines 1 and 2, which make a reference back to school district investing.
Everyone understand the concept here? The concept being that, again, this is just for the investment and equities piece. That's all we're discussing. It would not eliminate special districts, school districts from investing in other ways. So I think that, so Senator Hicks?
So on page 3, line 5, after school districts, you'd put a period there. Because once you bring in and other political subdivisions, that adds all those special districts.
So,
Senator Hicks, I'll let Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I would put the period, I would delete, strike through township and put a period after town.
Okay, all right, I just want to know where the period was at. Thank you.
So everyone's clear, the local government definition on page 3 would read, means a county, city, or town. And then there would be conforming amendments that would take out political subdivision, Roman 2. It would also take out the language on page 7 about, page 5 about the school districts. And we'll let LSO do some of the cleanup on that. But the concept is local government definition for this bill for equities investing only would be city or county, city, and town.
Yeah.
Brian?
And Mr. Chairman, just a note about, this bill and kind of vis-a-vis current law, there is a section of statute, and my apologies for not mentioning this when going through the bill. It's 94831 that specifies how local governments may invest in other types of investments that are not stocks and equities. That section is not at all implicated in this bill.
Right.
Okay.
This is solely equities.
So voice vote here to make for the amendment that was proposed by Representative Larson. Again, we're working this bill to move it to the next meeting. That we'll send it back to LSO and have them refine it. So that's why we didn't move it formally. We're just trying to fill in the blanks that we had from coming in, because this was the first crack at it that we're seeing it today. So voice vote, all those in favor of having local government definition be city, town, and city, county, town. All those in favor, aye? Aye. All those opposed, nay? Okay, so that'll be our local government definition, and Brian will make the conforming changes elsewhere in the bill where needed. Representative Storr, I missed your hand. Did you have a comment there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I was asking then, are we providing then a different definition for local government for these purposes than Brian cited in Title IX?
Representative Larson, and then I'll go to Brian, let you answer it from the legal perspective, and then.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr. So with the change in definition, this section, it would only apply for purposes of investing in stocks and equities, would be limited to counties, cities, and towns. Does not affect what other entities would be able to do under that section of statute.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Storr, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Larson?
Yeah, and Representative Storr, I go up to line 2 as used in this article. pertaining
Right.
to this. Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, further changes on page 3 or proposed ideas. Again, we're trying to fill in some of these blanks, answer some of the questions here today. Page 4.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this kind of runs through it, but I think it may start on page 4. But just as a conceptual amendment, what looking for here, Brian, is try to remove the IFC type language out of this bill entirely, and then try to go back to the side about brokers and what kind of experience, what kind of assets they have under their control. Work on a number, and I don't know what the number is, so I'm looking for some help from my fellow committee members if there's a number out there. But to try to, so in other words, to try to get that part out so we don't have 20 different IFCs out there, but just beef up the broker threshold. That make sense?
Yep. Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Brad.
Senator Gru, it does. A couple different options for, what that link, and maybe, I can refrain and wait until this concept is considered. But for numbers, I know the city of Casper mentioned 10 years, 110 million. Minnesota, my colleagues noted to me that I believe it was Minnesota that referenced, or maybe Kentucky referenced, had to be, regulated by a federal agency. I mean, those would be a couple options for that.
I'm not going.
Okay, so the concept is, and it really might make sense, because then we'd have two distinctly different bills. If we eliminate all the discussion for investing for this purpose in 125 of having an IFC-type board set up, that addresses Senator Hicks's concerns from earlier in the day. So is there some support for that? All those in favor of removing the IFC references in this bill, or I'm broadly saying IFC-type references in this bill, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Okay, so we will do that, and then we'll go to the second piece of Senator Guru's concept here, and that is he wants to put in some more stringent regulation on what kind of an investment advisor they may use, and I think he said 10 years, $50 million, magic number. He said 10, or Brian said 10 years.
10, he's.
I guess.
Yeah, Mr. I was just citing what the city of Casper noted. That
Okay,
was 10
that's-
years, 110 million.
It's fine.
So for this draft committee, would we agree to 10 years and for investment advisors and 110 million?
Too much? All right.
We did hear some concern that that might eliminate a lot of our local firms up and down Main Street in Wyoming. Brian, maybe we could look into a concept of how, if that firm partners with say, a large brokerage house, a JP Morgan or somebody like that. It's the local shingle, but that's who they invest under, that would be considered for their investment amounts. A UBS, a JP Morgan, somebody, but it's the local firm under that larger house, something to that effect. Does that work, committee? Okay. Further ideas and concepts on page 4. Page 5, we had a discussion earlier of duration. I think even the treasurer brought up duration has significant impacts due to the liquidity side. Is that 5 years? Everyone's still okay with that? Noting that these equity investments need to be longer duration to make it work. Seeing no major heartburn on that, I just pointed out, is it Representative Larson?
I'd just like to come back for discussion. We heard from the folks from Casper that the 5 years was brought up previously only if the local investment pool was the only option, if I'm understanding that correctly. And in this, it's not necessarily an option, and we could But at the same time, we had concerns that but they're not investing with the state, right? It's not a state, they're investing with the local, whomever they select. And so then they would be able to work out and negotiate that in their RFP, would they not? And so I think there's some experience there, and I think it's worth noting that it is just a little bit, this draft is a little bit different than the concern we talked about in our previous discussion. And so I think that I'm just trying to get a feel from the committee, but I could certainly support just eliminating that, but based on that. But if there's not any, then.
I think there's validity to your comment. Do we want to eliminate it for now? And I think the other one we missed on page 4 is the fees section. I think we probably want to eliminate that fees section because we're automatically saying what the fees will be by saying setting the cap that we know they're going to be the cap at that point. So
Right.
Page 4, lines 21 and 22, I'd say we should remove all those in favor of removing that, say aye.
Aye.
Nay. Okay, we'll remove that. That's the fees. Then moving on to page 5, this 5 years.
I'll make that motion.
Okay, all those in favor of eliminating the duration of 5 years, signify by saying aye.
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 Nays? Have 2 nays. We'll eliminate that, but I'd like to, Brian, leave a note in the bill, the next draft of this, that it was a tepid deletion.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Representative Larson.
if I may, I just want to, because I certainly could be mistaken, and I'm looking for help around this, but if they're going to invest these local dollars that are available and they're putting out an RFP, then they would be able to determine the length of time within that manager selection process in the RFP. Whereas if they were investing it through the treasurer's office and they're wanting to pull it out, everybody's wanting to pull it out at different times, that becomes more problematic. Now, am I seeing that accurately? And that was the reason that I changed it, because I think that allows, if they're going to have the flexibility to go into their own RFP process and select their manager, then they could adjust that accordingly rather than impacting the treasurer's office with that problem. So if I'm wrong on my understanding, I'm happy to relook at that, but.
Senator Hicks, I know you were a no vote on that. Share
Yeah,
your
and more
perspective.
than
Not that I
anything else,
disagree.
It comes back to what are we trying to do here? We're just trying to create a cash flow mechanism that's different than an investment strategy. And the longer you stay in the market, the higher probability you're going to get a rate of return, and you're not tempted to pull money out when you get a down market. And so it just provides some assurances over the long term that you're going to get a rate of return and a positive investment portfolio. And so to me, it's just an insurance policy. This is versus a knee-jerk reaction to the markets. The longer you're in there, the higher likelihood that you're going to make money. And so
And Mr.
I'm just overly cognizant of the fact that having bought a couple college educations, because I wasn't in for the duration, and looking at even the state's portfolio, it's only been a couple of years ago, we lost $1 billion, right? Now it looks really good 3 or 4 years later. And so that's the idea here. If we're going to get rid of all these other constraints, at least that 5 year doesn't mean that under a scenario that they can't spend those investment returns. It just says the corpus has got to be in an investment strategy for a minimum of a 5 year to ensure that there's a higher probability of a rate of return in equities. And that's why I'm not comfortable creating just what I would say a stock market slot machine that you're playing every 3 months. I'm really concerned about just creating an investment strategy like that. I think it negates the purposes of what we're trying to do.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at 5-year duration doesn't make sense in most stock investments. If they're dealing with a local broker who's putting their funds in an exchange traded fund, they can pull out at any time without an impact on that exchange traded fund or municipal fund. So I'm with Representative Larson. Let's just eliminate the duration for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also, it still doesn't make any sense to me to have the requirement for duration under Romanet 4 on page 5. Again, like most likely investing in funds or ETFs would be the likely vehicle. But to Senator Hicks's concern, I guess I would go in and say, maybe take the language that our friends from Casper offered for on page 4, what the requirements are for someone who's in charge of making these investments, and replace sections A and B on lines 14 through 19 on page 4 with the qualifications she suggested. That I don't have the exact language, but I thought that made a lot more sense. And given that, I think that would tell us that, you know, they know what they're doing and they're managing. You're still managing for the long term, but how you do that may require you to, you know, change up stocks or funds in a variety of ways.
Okay. So for now, we're going to leave, we voted to take it out, but we're going to leave a side note that we do want to revisit the conversation because we see it as a safeguard and still have some concerns there. So it's not gone forever. Any other comments on page 5? Suggested changes? Moving on to page 6. First staff comments eliminated because we took that section about school districts out with an earlier change. And so now we're on page 7, and this is where we need to fill in some blanks. Page 7, line 7, how do we want to decide the amount that local governments we feel they should be able to invest? And again, this kind of comes from the Colorado and the Kentucky and the other states that allow these investments in equities. They don't say, go do it all. They try to have some constraints of some kind. I agree with the comments earlier that it should be a percentage, not a fixed dollar, as every municipality, every government's going to have a different amount. And so 100,000 to one entity is going to be a lot different than 100,000 to another. So, Brian?
Mr. Chairman?
Or Senator Hicks?
I would just make a motion that we delete section A in there, in excess of X dollars more than the local government's operating budget. I think, again, I think what's pointed out, the operating budget's kind of irrelevant. What we're really going to be invested is reserves. And so I think that section ought to just be deleted. So line 7 through 9 would be just to delete.
Okay. All those in favor of deleting subsection A, say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Okay, we'll delete that. We'll move on to subsection B. Thoughts on subsection B? This is page 7, lines 11 through 13. I had a note that we should maybe delete that from the comment that was made that here in Natrona County, when the county sold the physical assets of the hospital, those monies came in, and why would it make sense to hold those for an extended period prior to being able to take advantage? Other thoughts?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Storr, sorry I missed you.
that's okay. I would make that motion.
Okay, so the idea is to remove subsection B. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those
Aye.
opposed, nay. Representative Larson. Essentially, yes. So then we're on down in subsection 2, Romanet 2, lines 15 through 18. And this is really probably the most pertinent section here. How much of their total investable money do we want them to allow in equities? And Brian, remind me, was it about 35% was Kentucky, and Colorado was somewhere in that same ballpark? If you happen to have that handy, could you, or Catherine, I see you waving your hand. We have a great team over here, thank you.
Chairman Walters, for example, Minnesota statute, qualifying governments may invest up to 15% of the sum of unassigned cash, cash equivalents, deposits, I don't know how much.
15.15?
15.15.
Okay.
15%. Colorado does not appear to have any percentage limitations except in the case of firefighter pension funds.
Okay.
And Kentucky has several percentage limitations based on different classes. So for example,
Quick eyeball of Kentucky, what's their range or their rough average? Is it, and not a
Yes,
hard
okay,
number, just a
so-
quick eyeball glance as you look at it.
sure, individual equity securities for investment shall be included within the S&P 500 and shall not exceed 25% of that equity allocation. There are some further limitations such as the amount of money invested at any time by a local government or political subdivision in any category of investments shall not exceed 20% of the total amount of money invested. So it gets a little more prescriptive down the line,
Good,
but it appears a range of 15 to 25%.
very good. So committee, I'd like to see us plug a number in, but somebody pick the number and we'll argue over it then.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go with our local folks and say 20% of the available investable dollars. I'm not quite sure that I understood that there needs to be a range of 10 to 30%. I don't know quite what that means. But if we have 20% of investable dollars, does that get us where you think we ought to be? Right, but if we put in the amount, the percentage of the total amount of money, is 20% going to work, or does that need to be in that 10 to 30% range, or does it need to be 30%?
Could we have you come up and answer that so that the folks on the internet
you,
can
Mr.
hear?
Chairman.
Just get to a microphone.
So,
I'm just
Mr.
trying to better
Chairman,
understand that.
Before they get up here, if I can add on,
Senator Hicks.
add on to the question. In the context of what they're talking about, this is an asset allocation of 10 to 30% in equities. And now we're talking about a percentage of what they have in their reserves or what they could invest. And so it's really two different questions there. One's an asset allocation question. One's is how much is the total amount you can invest in equities. And so I guess that's the question. As I read the language here, there's really two different questions there.
Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman Walters and Senator Hicks. What we were meaning by that is the investable dollars. So it would include whatever we have, for example, in WyoStar 1 or WyoStar 2, the total pool of investments. If we allocated a target of 20% to allow and still be within like an investment policy statement, if the market were to go up, to give us a limitation of not ever more than 30, and if the market were to drop, then not less than 10. So to give you a range to operate within, if you wish to phrase it another way, you could say not more than 30%, and then anything under that would be acceptable.
And it is of reserves.
So that's the question, is it's of what?
Of the total reserves.
So I think the structured base would be, can't invest more than 30% of your reserves in equities and stocks.
Yes,
That's
sir.
the language that we would add. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Brian, do you have that? So the concept here is not to exceed 30% of the amount in reserves.
Into stocks and equities.
Into the equities, which we don't have to say into stocks and equities because that's what the whole bill is about.
So that comes back to the question, and it does in the constitutional amendment say as prescribed by the legislature. So again, we just limited the amount of money. They can invest in stock and equities now, but it's not to exceed 30% of their reserve amounts.
Correct.
And Mr.
Brian?
Chairman, I just want to be clear then, I think what I'm hearing is the total amount of funds that can be invested versus the question of, of the investment portfolio, what percentage of that portfolio could constitute stocks and equities?
That's the question that I was trying to get to. It's 30% of their reserves can be invested in equities. Is that, Brian?
So, yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, that would answer, I think, the first question, the amount of funds that can be invested. That would leave then unanswered the question of what percentage of that total portfolio could be invested in stocks. I think they're two separate concepts. So this says, if I have $1 million, 300,000 of it can go, in reserves, 300,000 can go into equities. But if that's all for whatever reason, I'm choosing to invest, then 100% of my investment portfolio is now stocks and equities.
Yeah, so we want to make sure the safeguard is in there and it's drafted to where it's 30% of the total investment portfolio can only be invested in the equity, stocks and equities. So to your example, the $1 million, 300,000 could be in stocks and equities and 700 somewhere else, not all 300, because that's where the only way you're doing it. So make sure that the language states that, and I think that answers it's what Senator Hicks was getting to, based on my understanding of his question.
So let's take that $1 million example and back to what Brian was suggesting. If you put $700,000 and you just made it in a cash account, and you put $300,000 in equities, that's 100% of your investments is in equities. But it's only 30% of your total reserves. And so that's where I get back. I think so that 100% is fine as long as it's only 30% of your total reserves. But I think what Brian's saying, it's 100% of your investments is in equities. The rest is just cash in reserves. What we want to make sure is that's an option that's available. If a local government had that $1 million and they wanted to keep 700,000 just in cash, and then they took 300,000 and invested in stocks and equities, that's fine. That's 30% of their reserves. Right. Correct?
Correct.
That's what I'm trying to clarify. So it's 30% of your reserves. It's not 30% of your investment portfolio.
Well, cash could still be considered an investment.
Yeah, that's an asset allocation.
Correct.
But you've made a determination to keep that in cash.
Correct.
Representative Larson, you had a question?
So I was curious if we had the right terminology there, but if I'm understanding it right, that $1 million is investable income, of which they are only allowed to invest 30% of into equities. That remaining 700,000 that they choose, they could invest other places. If they choose to leave it in cash, that's fine, whatever they want to do. So am I understanding that the same as you, Larry? Okay, thank you.
I think that's the intent, is it not? With the language that you could do up to 30% you got 70% any other asset allocation, whether it's cash, treasuries, bonds, whatever, you could still utilize that other 70% however you want it.
Currently, we're limited to using T-bills and T-notes and government-backed securities.
So Brian, you have language that can address what we just walked through, and it'll make sense. Very good. So I think we have that addressed. Our good legal staff will
Thank you.
help us out there. Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most investment advisors like to have a range. So, for example, as we discussed, 10 to 30%. So if equities drop below 10%, they need to invest more. If they exceed 30%, they need to pull money out of equities and invest it elsewhere. That's why percentages are typically used. Hope that helps.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that with the cap is, the local government can decide the floor, but we're setting the cap, and so I think that'll be good. Okay, we've answered the big question there. Anything else on page 7? Note that Romanet 3 does talk about how earnings from that will not be counted against it, so they don't have to immediately sell something because they made something to balance the portfolio, which is, I think, good. Page 8 and page 9.
Yeah, but Mr. Chairman, I think to maybe expedite, given the previous amendment to delete the advisory committee, it would next be page 11, line 14.
Correct, that's where I was headed. Thank you, Brian, for the, we're on page 11, lines 14. And we're talking about reporting, and the question is, who do they report to? And what are they reporting? So I made notes that they could report to the treasurer, the Department of Audit, and the auditor. And then I also had a note that they could, when they reported to the treasurer, they could, through a pool, pay the treasurer to have their outside firm, such as an RVK or a Makita, review it, and either for a stress test or just to ensure that it's on the right track. But I might be going a little overboard. So, any thoughts or who they should report to? I hate reports, or reports aren't always that great because everyone just puts them on the shelf and doesn't review them. So having somebody that's going to do something with them may have some value. Brian?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, the only other observation I would offer is, the discussion of flexibility, it could be something left to the local government to determine as well.
Any thoughts from the committee?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, on the reporting requirement, I just don't see the necessity to reporting back to a state agency that has no jurisdiction or authority to do anything. It's let's just call it a gummer. They send another report to somebody that can't really do anything. And so if we were going to do a report, being how this is a legislative initiative, I think they ought to supply a report back to the joint appropriations or this committee for review, not a state agency that has no input whatsoever in what the local governments are doing. That's just my thoughts. Unless we want to put in there we're putting another duty on an agency that has no authority to do anything with the information anyway. So it seems like it's just a waste of time to me. That's my thoughts.
Pardon me.
Mr. Chairman, local governments do get audited, so just food for thought.
So maybe committee, if we just remove the reporting requirement? So I move to remove the reporting requirement altogether. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, nay. So we'll just remove it, knowing that they will be audited anyhow.
I'm pretty sure that it'll show up in the local paper if something.
Now we're on to page 13. This is the Representative Larson.
Did we do anything with the consulting with the treasurer? I've got some, is that a valid, any thoughts from the locals on this requirement to consult with the treasurer? What's in the purpose of that? That'd be your town treasurer, county treasurer, right? Am I seeing that right?
What page?
That's on top of page 11, line 4 through 7.
That was all eliminated with the IFC discussion.
Perfect, never mind. Just testing you.
You're fine. I think we're on the top of page 13, and this is how earnings and losses are treated. And this is basically what we call in state government the Meyer rule. I think it has validity so that local governments would be able to carry those losses over until they're recovered instead of having to account for them right away. And but if the local governments don't want it, let us know now. If not, we'll leave it in the bill and okay, we'll leave it in the bill. Any other thoughts or suggestions on 125? Okay, we're not taking a vote of any kind on this today as we made significant amendments and changes to it. So we will see a more final draft at our October 30th, did you tell me, Karen? The late October meeting of Capital Finance and Investment. We'll see this draft again, and we'll have it, at that time, we can take a formal vote on it.
Yes, that meeting is scheduled for Cheyenne, October 30th.
October 30th in Cheyenne. So that's when we'll see this again. If there are any other thoughts or comments between now and then, committee members or the public, please let myself or Ellis, let myself know, and I'll share those with LSO. So knowing that we made those significant changes, there's, I don't think, a reason to vote on it today because we wouldn't know what we were voting on. We did so many deletions and additions. So we'll wait for the final copy. So with that, not seeing any others on 125, we'll move to 126. Representative Larson.
Could we just adopt any of the conforming amendments from 125 now into 126? Or do we have to revisit all of that?
I think we can, if it's okay with the committee. I see a bunch of head nods down the table. So action we took in 125 that would be similar in 126, we would like to carry those over to 126. Brian?
And Mr. Chairman, I think the only question, just to be absolutely sure I'm on the right track, would be that investment advisory committee for this bill.
Stays in place in this bill because that's the purpose of this bill, is to set up that structure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The other ones, the local government piece and some of those other, the reporting and things like that are the ones that we were referencing. So now we're on 126 committee. Again, this is broadly based on the local government liability pool. Our friends at the County Commission Association shared us a memo or a concept at our June meeting. And that's what our fine LSO staff crafted this on.
And Mr. Chairman, just to go back to the question that you asked earlier about compensation, I could not find that in that article of statute where it specifies the compensation for those board members. So I assume it's handled basically by the agreement of the board itself, how that would work. But I did not see anything in the statutes that called that out.
So because it's not called out, and I think it ought to be called out so that we're clear, a section that says board members on this IFC-like board would be paid at the same rate as legislators and same per diem as legislators. And we use that language for other boards and commissions we have.
So, Mr.
And
Chairman,
it's for days that they work and et cetera.
yeah, I'm fine with that, but where does the funds come from?
They'll come from the general fund.
So we're now going to pay,
Or, excuse me, yeah, they'll come from the pool.
okay, that's what I want to make sure of,
Yes.
is this is their pool, this
Yes,
is not the
you're
state's pool.
correct. They'll need to come from
So it
their
would be
pool.
from investment earnings or whatever the fees associated cost is.
Yeah, from the pool.
Mr. Chairman, just a question on that. Should we leave that determination up to that board, whether they want to pay their board members or not? Or should we just specify? That's a question.
The reason I throw it out there as the way I did is to create consistency among our other boards there are other boards that are paid by their own fees, but a lot of those, we still use the legislative rate for consistency, but I'm happy to go wherever with it. I just think somewhere in here, we need to say how they're compensated and what they do, whether it's let the board decide or we decide. Representative Larson.
I would suggest that we say that the, based on the language you use, but the fees are distributed from the assessments collected by the participating local government, and that's that language on page 6 on line 20 and 21. So where they get it from, if they put it in their budget or collect it from the revenue of the things, that's each they would have to participate in paying that assessment.
And I think this is one we can revisit in October. We'll let, they know that we're wanting to work on this, and so they can go back and decide how they want it structured, but at least.
Mr. Chairman, could we make that permissive? They may. In other words, if they decide to, they can reimburse those board members.
Yeah, I think we can craft it that way.
Mandatory.
Yeah. So that was big picture throughout on the bill. So we'll go back to page 4, 5. Do we want to set how large this board can become? A maximum number of members. You know, it was discussed earlier that if we had 27 entities participating, we'd have 27 board members. We really wanted to keep it to more board members from each area, you know, so a board member from a city, a board member from a county, a board member from a special district, things of that nature. Do we want to try and limit that? Or does it automatically limit itself in the existing language? Committee, what are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks?
Given the nature of the type of investments, I think this is self-limiting already. I mean, we've restricted it out to cities, towns, and counties. I just don't see a lot of my towns like Medicine Bow, Hanna, Elk Mountain, Bear Oil, Wamsutter, Baggs, Dixon, and Savory participating in this because they don't have the cash reserves to even participate. So you're talking about a very small subset already. And so my guess is we're probably talking less than maybe on the very extreme 15 potential entities that would be participating in this pool. And I may be wrong. I just, somebody that represents a lot of small towns, they can't even hardly cash flow to keep the water and the lights running, let alone having millions to invest in stocks and equities. And so I think just the nature of the very contemplating what we're talking about, investing a lot of money is going to limit this to a very small number of people, entities within the state of Wyoming. So I don't know if we need to set a number on the board. Maybe, again, you make it permissive to allow them, if we're really going to allow local control, allow that, set a threshold and something of that effect and make it permissive that they may regulate or the number of entities. My gut feeling, it will self-regulate itself.
Okay. Okay, we'll leave that. Moving on to page 6 and 7. Any additions? Committee, anything from Jeremiah or Ashley that we're missing that you wanted us to include that's not already there? Just speak up if you see it. Come on forward, Jeremiah, let's hear it.
Mr. Chairman, again, members of the committee, Jeremiah Riemann with the County Commissioners Association. I do appreciate that you're leaving some latitude in this. If you're not aware, you know, of course, this requires a joint powers board to be set up. Joint powers boards have to be reviewed by the Attorney General's office before you can ever proceed. So there's going to be some checks and balances that the state is going to have in this regard. Mr. Chairman, my broad comment really quickly goes to the notion of pool. Pool's used in here a number of times, and I think it's permissive to allow for multiple pools within the pool that would be set up by the Joint Powers Board. But to the extent it's not, I would ask for that capability. Because as I mentioned, you may have a situation where we establish a pool with a 5-year horizon and a $5 million minimum, and another pool with a 20-year horizon and a $20 million threshold to get in. I think you want to have that flexibility to allow for us to structure this to allow for different investment vehicles for the local governments that would participate.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks?
a question, Jeremiah. When I look at this, the pool is the entities. It's not the investments. And so the pool is the number of entities that are involved in the Joint Powers Board. The number of investment asset allocation strategies is unlimited to that pool. And am I missing something here? Or do you really want us to specify that you can, because now I think you're talking about asset allocation, you know, how many different investment pools can the board, and I don't think we ought to get in that business. I think, so I'm asking the question, is that what you're talking about? Because I'm confused now that there's different pools. I thought one pool was the entities. That pool will determine what those asset allocations are, and we're not going to mess with that. I don't think you want us messing with that.
Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Mr. Chairman, as I testified at the last meeting, I'm by no means an expert in this space. My review of the legislation is just exactly as you suggested. But to the extent that I'm not right, and that there is a limitation, I was just bringing that forward to make sure that it allowed for what both you and I believe is there.
Brian or Ian, could you, Brian, to answer Senator Hicks's question, is the pool the entire group that decides to get in on the investing and the asset allocation, and that this bill would allow them to have multiple investments, a 5-year horizon, a 10-year, or whatever they said, using those as examples?
So, Mr. Chairman, the term pool means the pool as the program. Mr. Chairman, there is language, I don't have it right in front of me, for the state investments that contemplates this concept where, you know, they can be divided into different pools for purposes of investments. And I can find that and either put it in a staff comment or in the bill for consideration at the next meeting.
So, Mr. Chairman, with the conforming amendments that we made from the last, we've already constrained that to 30% equities within this pool. And I just want to ask Jeremiah if that's consistent, because now even when you form this pool, you're back to only 30% of your total. So all these, say there's 10 different entities bring money in here, you're limited to 30% investment in equities. What that rest of that asset allocation is, that's up to you guys, but you're constrained now within that pool. Well, and it could be 100% of the pool, back to the way that language is drafted, because each local entity is only going to be able to invest 30% of their reserves into equities. So the pool, I'm assuming, is always going to be equities. So 100% of that pool would be equities, because we've already constrained how much they can even put in the pool, right? But it could be 100%. So it's just an equity pool is what you're, and how you allocate that across all of those different potential stocks and equities is really up to, you know, there's unlimited.
Brian had a comment to answer that. Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I have a comment to answer that specifically, but I did find that statute. It's 94716A2, and all it says is nothing in this section shall be construed to prevent the state treasurer from pooling any state funds for investment purposes, including meeting cash flow requirements in accordance with the approved investment policy statements.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, Brian, would you concur with that, with the language that we put in? That this pool is only going to be for equities by this joint powers board, and it's restricted to 30% of whatever those individual pool members' reserves are?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, that's correct. I think the comment is getting at, say, within that 30%, or if different participants, if a city says, put this away for 30 years versus County B that says, I'm looking at 15 years, the question is, can this board say, we're going to have this amount of money going here and this amount of money going there?
And my response would be yes, that's up to them.
Exactly.
But it would all be in equities if they chose to do it that way.
Thank you. That's my preference.
Yes, thank you. So question was answered for Senator Hicks, pages 6 and 7, 8 and 9. Representative Larson?
This might be black helicopters, and this question really goes out to the locals on the board makeup. So the board is determined by the local governments, and it shall include members from the different types of local governments. So in a scenario where you've got, let's say, 5 towns, 5 cities, and 2 counties, then they determine what the board makeup is going to be. The 2 counties may have 70% of the money in there, but now can be outvoted on board makeup and on decisions by the towns and cities. And so, am I scared of my own shadow here? And if I am, fine. I just didn't know if anybody else had contemplated that, and if they just throwing that out there as an observation and a question.
Jeremiah?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator
I think
Hicks?
this gets back to the question of the makeup, because if we use the Joint Powers Board current statutes, that's exactly what could happen. And so unless we do something different and say, make a special provision for this Joint Powers Board that it's based on a certain level of financial contributions, that's exactly what would happen under the Joint Powers Board. You could have I believe, a 1% ownership in this pool, but you have the same voting rights as somebody that has 70% ownership. I think, but I'm curious but I believe that's the way the Joint Powers Board would operate.
Jeremiah, Ashley, thoughts and comments on that
Mr. Chairman,
concern?
I don't know that this concerns me all that much. And I come to it from this perspective. Ultimately, whoever creates this Joint Powers Board is going to agree to the creation of that Joint Powers Board. It's very possible that if this bill passes, that Ashley and I are going to sit down and we're going to hash out what a Joint Powers Board might look like and what the allocation of membership is, and then ultimately go to our members and say, do you agree with this? So we're going to have that conversation up front. I also don't read this legislation to say that we have to bind ourselves together. I actually could read it one way, and the good attorney staff here could say, or correct me if I'm wrong, but we could just say we're going to set up a Joint Powers Board amongst the counties and operate this pool, or operate a pool, and they could do one themselves. I don't think that's what we really want, but that could happen, I think, under this structure. So, to the extent that we're worried about the municipalities having too many votes, I think we have other mechanisms to address that.
Yeah, they can have absolute control.
Yep.
Yeah, they could do that.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Further discussion, pages 8 and 9. We go on to page 10, we have a couple X's we need to fill in. On line 9, starting on line 9 of page 10. Brian, catch me if I've missed some of the blanks that I need.
So, Mr. Chairman, those changes I took, kind of
took,
that
okay.
blanket
Just-
from the last one would
Just
go
making
here.
sure we had that. Yep. And then we go on to page 11, starting on line 7. That's the, what we call the Meyer rule. This is the, how to handle the losses if they occur over time. Page 12, on the bottom of page 12, lines 26, 27, there was a question about having the CIO of the state as well as the retirement system as ex officio non-voting members. Do we need them there?
Misery loves company.
Mr. Chairman, I think the question is not as whether we need them, it's as to whether they want to be there.
Oh, no, they don't want.
So I think I would say we would remove those two folks. And if all those in favor say aye, okay, nays, don't see any concerns there. Any other thoughts on 12 or 13? '14, '15.
And Mr. Chairman, I would just highlight page 15, given the, their previous discussions on qualifications of these members, that may just be a point of highlight for consideration. The language on page 15, lines 1 to 15 are directly from the current IFC kind of qualifications.
Do we want to remove that, committee? Or change it, modify it? And I think to Senator Hicks's comment earlier in the morning of, okay, I think that's a good recommendation. Any concern with that? I see a bunch of heads nodding, so we'll conform that to 10 years, 110 million. Any other concerns or thoughts on 126? Committee? Brian? Any X's that we didn't fill in? If so, you and I can work on those and we can poll the committee if necessary. Okay. I think we started with a very rough draft and we now have it refined to a rough draft. But I don't think it's quite as rough as it was before, so we are gaining. For the committee and for those listening online, I think we've wrapped up that topic. Is there any other public comment on that topic? We took it throughout, so I think we should be covered. I don't see anyone racing to the mics, so we will end our discussion on local government investing. Our next on our agenda is, and we're running behind here a little bit, is investment manager alternative investment approval. But following that is our investment performance update. We have some consultants that will be participating in that investment performance update. So we are going to take the 11:30 item at 11:30, which will be next. We will go to item number 3 after lunch, which is the investment manager alternative approvals legislation. So again, item number 3, we will take up first thing after lunch. And at this time, we will move to our item number 4, which is the 11:30 item, investment performance update from the State Treasurer's Office as well as the Wyoming Retirement System and their consultants. So we're technically on time, and it's really easy to be on time when you just skip items or move them around the agenda. All right. Patrick, welcome and good morning. Thank you for being in Casper today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Fleming, CO from the Treasurer's Office. For the performance update, I'm going to pass it over to Becky Gratzinger from RBK, and she is going to start us off. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see you virtually. I'll be joined in a moment by Joe Ledgerwood, my colleague. I know he may need a special link to get in. So if someone could take care of that. I had planned to start our section with just a few comments about the market environment we've been in for this fiscal year. It really has been a very, very productive fiscal year when it comes to absolute returns for most asset classes. If we look at the returns that we saw through 6/30, it really is incredible. Just to give you an idea, because you're going to see a lot of returns for the individual funds and for all assets. But when we look at the fiscal year market results, I'll just give you a few numbers to take note of. The S&P 500 for the fiscal year ending in 6/30 is 24.6%, an incredible year. And a lot of us know some of the reasons for that. Really a lot of euphoria about the Fed pivoting to an easing mode, which they have yet to do. But as we know, are expected to begin easing interest rates in September, this month, later this month. We saw productive returns from small cap equities in the year here in the US, returns around 10%. International developed markets were up a little bit more than that, 11.5%. Emerging markets were up about 12.6%. The bond market managed a positive return of 2.6% in an environment of rising interest rates. Ironically, when we look at what's happening in fixed income, there's been a lot of talk about an inverted yield curve environment where shorter term securities yield more than 30-year securities. And we're starting to see that normalize now to move towards a flat yield curve and hopefully upward sloping yield curve, which is a more normal environment for the fixed income. As we look at other markets, really the market that suffered in this fiscal year was a real estate market with a lot of properties continuing to be marked down. Different types of properties perform quite differently during the fiscal year, but we're optimistic that some of this markdown cycle is nearing an end, or at least from a rate of change perspective starting to slow down, and we're still getting income from those properties, which is terrific. And then we see other types of investments such as hedge funds and other diversifying strategies doing quite well last year, with the universe of hedge funds up about 8.5%. So as we move forward into this fiscal year, it will be probably somewhat of a different environment, although our domestic stock market continues to be very influenced by what's going on with artificial intelligence. Stocks like NVIDIA are in the news almost every single day. The technology sector really drove a lot of the returns in the fiscal year. So we're hoping that the market will broaden out as we move forward. So in your packet, if you look at page 3 of the investment performance report, this is just a reminder of all the assets that Joe is going to be talking about in terms of their relative performance by pool. But you are at $29.9 billion as of the end of June, almost to that $30 billion mark. And you can see the relative size of the funds that we follow and help you oversee. The Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, $11.3 billion. The Permanent Land Fund, about $300,000. You can go down $300 million as you go down the list. The next largest fund, of course, is Common School at $5.3 billion. Workers' Comp, $2.6 billion. So this is just a breakdown to remind you of the various pools that we will be reporting on. So bottom line, when you see these numbers for the fiscal year, they're going to be very good numbers. Really, the only exception is real estate, as I mentioned, and investments in long-term fixed income securities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe Ledgerwood, who is part of our team. And again, thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, for us to give you this brief update today. Joe?
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Becky noted, my name is Joe Ledgerwood. I'm a senior consultant at RBK. As Becky noted, the prior 12 months ending June 30 were generally strong for capital markets. On page 4, a summary of the total fund performance can be found. Because this is a roll-up of all of the underlying funds, we think it's important to focus on the relative returns, not the absolute returns. And as you can see in that bottom line, the gray highlighted line, for the fiscal year, the total fund outperformed its index by 1.4%, and it outperforms on all trailing basis going back in history. At the bottom half of the page, you can see the asset class returns, both on an absolute and relative basis. I'll draw your attention to the international equity line item there. And I do that because that's one of the larger, it's the second largest asset class exposure of the funds. It returned 14.25%, almost 2 percentage points above its index. And the largest component of the funds is the core fixed income, which returned 3.27%, a little over 0.5% more than the index. Asset class market values and allocation percentages and performance for the fiscal year can be found on pages 5 and 6. And as Becky noted, real estate is the only notable negative performer on an absolute basis for the asset classes. I'm going to move now to page 7, which breaks out the performance of the asset class pools. Consistent with the total fund, each individual pool met or exceeded its index for the fiscal year. The color coding indicates common asset allocations within each of these pools. You'll see the Mineral Trust outperformed its benchmark by 2 percentage points for the fiscal year. Similarly, the Common School Fund returning 10.9% versus 8.8% for the total fund index, another 2%, roughly 2% outperformance. The Workers' Compensation Fund returned 5.3%, which is roughly 1% above its index. You'll note the long-term reserve, which has a more total return asset allocation, returned 10.9%, while the liability hedging assets returned 0.8%, which is in line with the relative asset allocations of both of those funds. The LISRA total fund returned 8.3%, beating its benchmark by 0.8 percentage points. And as I noted above, the long-term reserve, which has a more growth-oriented asset allocation, had a lot higher absolute return relative to the intermediate reserve and the short-term reserve. Moving on to page 9, you'll see the standard deviation on a rolling 3-year basis of each of the pools relative to the 70-30 reference benchmark. You'll note that each of the funds has a realized volatility or risk profile roughly half of what reference index has, which is a positive indicator. And finally, on slide 11, you can see the risk-adjusted rolling 3-year return. The bolded line there indicates the Sharpe ratio or the return per unit of risk the index has achieved. And notably, both the Common School Fund and the Permanent Mineral Trust have consistently exceeded that, returning in excess of the index on a risk-adjusted basis. Those are our prepared remarks today, and we appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us to speak on them.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Becky or Joe? I think the broad question is, you can promise to do this again next year, is that correct?
That's a pretty tall order, Mr. Chairman. We'll see what we can do.
Thank you. Thank you. Your crystal ball is as cloudy as the rest of ours, so we appreciate that. Any other questions for Becky or Joe? Okay. Patrick, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, one thing I do want to comment on is we've talked before about the WyoStar returns that we've had, and I know we've testified in front of this committee before, and we talked about, no, the WyoStar 2 fund, which was investing in corporates, has done a great job. And there were other people who came up and said, well, it's only yielding 1%. And it's like, well, that's the current yield, not the yield to maturity. And there was a lot of people who were going out saying, well, it's a lower yield. And I know we've talked about this before, but I do just want to highlight what happens when you see a bond mature, when it goes from a discount to par. And so if you, I'll just tell you, we don't have to look at it, but page 37, the WildStar 2 fund actually had a 6% yield because these bonds matured and is exactly as we said, and it the manager outperformed by 20 basis points. So just to make sure everyone is aware that yes, the WildStar funds 1 and 2 are doing exactly as what they're supposed to do. And the manager is outperforming the benchmark. So now that we have another year data, I just wanted to highlight that, but that's it that I had, unless there's other questions.
Any questions for Mr. Fleming or Treasurer Meyer? All right. You're off the... Okay, I don't see any on the screen, so Treasurer Meyer, Mr. Fleming, thank you for being here. Thanks for the update. Keep up the good work. We appreciate it. Next, we'll have our folks from the Wyoming Retirement System. Go ahead.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here in Casper. It really is a beautiful day outside as we got off the car this morning. I'm David Swindell, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Retirement System, and we're here to present the committee a short update on investment performance in the Wyoming Retirement System's pension fund. As a reminder to the folks that may be watching, I know the committee already knows this, this is about an $11 billion fund at this point. It supports the pension payments of about 36,000 pensioners, most of whom reside in Wyoming. Last year, we paid out $800 million in benefits, and 78% of that money stayed in Wyoming. That's about $624 million. It went to all the counties to support our retirees in those areas. $77 million went right here to Natrona County. So it gives you an idea of the spread. In Crook County, only $7.5 billion. But still, $7.5 million in Crook County, that's pretty big money. One of the other counties I looked at, Hot Springs County, 6.6 million, but that's a lot of money for a pretty small place, and it winds up being about 3-4% of total county income. So these are important payments to support communities and people in Wyoming. And in the pension world, since Wyoming pensions are pre-funded, it's investment results that pay the majority of that. About 68% of a pension is ultimately paid for with investment earnings, which is why the topic of investment performance for this committee is relevant today. So just briefly, we had a pretty good year over the last year. For the year ending June 30th, 2024, the fund earned 11.96%, beating our benchmarks and ranking in the 10th percentile for pure funds. So that's pretty good performance. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Masudi, our Chief Investment Officer, who oversees that $11 billion. And he'll give you some more details, and then we'll introduce Mika Malone from Makita Consulting. That's our independent investment consultant. And Mika's going to talk more about the attribution of those results. So did it come from manager selection, asset allocation, and how much risk we had to take in order to earn that money? So Sam, over to you.
Right. Yes, I think we had a very solid past year. That being said, we always want to be focused on the longer term. So we've shaded on page 2 the 3, 5, and 7-year returns, and really pleased with the returns there. You can see we're beating benchmark by over 1% in all those periods. So over the 5-year period, 1.3%. It's equivalent to about $630 million of outperformance, and we're in the second percentile there. And even our benchmark was 30th percentile, meaning it outperformed 70% of our peers. So not an easy benchmark to beat by any means. So really pleased with the long-term record and outperforming our actuarial target of 6.8% very considerably. So that's it, and we can turn it over to Mika now unless there are any questions.
Questions before we go to Makita for Sam or David? All right, we'll see what she has to say and might spur some questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Loud and clear, please proceed.
Thanks so much. Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to be referring to the Makita slides that you likely have before you. So I'll start my comments on page 7 of 39. And just highlighting some of the statistics that Sam and Dave shared with you all, I wanted to highlight that performance, as stated, was very strong for the trailing year, up what you see here, rounded 12% for the 1-year period relative to the strategic blended benchmark of 11.7%. Importantly, on the right-hand side of this page where you see the 2 pie charts, I wanted to highlight really when I think about what's driving the performance of the Wyoming Retirement System's pension fund, I want to think about where those assets are held. And so if you look at the 2 pie charts, the top one is the target allocation.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, if I can interrupt for a second, I apologize. So the page Mika is referring to is 7 of 39 of her presentation, but that's 12 of the entire package. This is a clarification. Pardon the interruption.
Perfect. Everyone on track as to where we are? Page 12, if you're looking at the bottom center number, if you're looking at the lower right number, it's page 7 of 39. All right, committee members, we're all on track. Thanks for your patience. Please proceed.
Oh, thank you, Sam, for clarifying. I apologize for not having the broader page numbers. So on that right-hand side of the page with the pie charts where you see the current allocation in the bottom, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that should stand out. One of which is, and this will not be a surprise, but a pension system is in the business of needing to take risk in order to pay those long-term benefits. And so risk assets, which we think of as equity assets primarily, are going to be the driving force of return. So in an environment that I think Becky laid out quite nicely from RVK, where you had equity markets produce very strong double-digit returns, you should expect that this portfolio would also produce strong returns. And so we have a little over half of the portfolio targeted to public and private equity assets, and a little under half of the portfolio actually allocated as we sat at June 30th, 2024, to those assets. Several other places that contribute to returns are within your marketable alternatives portfolio. This is where some of the hedge funds in the program live. And then in your marketable fixed income portfolio, which is where the bonds in the portfolio live. Today, bonds have produced more of a return towards that actuarial assumed rate than we have seen certainly in the previous 5 years. So it's been nice to have the contribution of fixed income assets. Obviously, those dampen volatility. So from our perspective, where fixed income can play a greater role, that certainly helps any pension system looking forward. If we move forward 2 slides to attribution, so for me, this is page 9 of 39, and you'll see the 1-year attribution summary is the title of the page. This is where Makita takes a snapshot for what's driving that 12% 1-year return that you just heard from Sam and Dave over the period. And we look at a couple of things on this page. To me, the most important are the blue bars and the green bars. And what those are trying to share are what is the driver of performance. The green bar means that asset allocation, so where dollars were allocated to, say, fixed income instead of equities or to marketable alternatives instead of privates, where is that contributing to performance? And then the blue bars say within those asset categories, are the managers overall adding value above and beyond their benchmarks? And so when we look at the total fund, the top line, for the 1-year period, you had outperformance of about 30 basis points. That's the orange dot on the right-hand side. And what you see is that that is driven primarily for the period by the selection effect. And when you look further down on the right-hand side of the page, you see that within marketable alternatives and private real assets, along with private equity, all 3 areas where each of those respective asset classes, the underlying managers within them produced positive results, and that helped contribute to that outperformance for the period. Notable detractors for the period on the asset allocation side, real assets. This is an area, as again was discussed, I think, by RVK, but the real estate component of the marketplace was more challenged. So returns here just overall were lower than other asset categories. So any dollars you had allocated to there hurt your performance. And then you were slightly underweight marketable equities, which was an area of very strong absolute performance. So that is a negative when you think about your overall results. But again, the net effect is that you outperformed your benchmark for the period. I'm going to take you, because I think it's important to think about the longer term more than just a 1-year period. So if you don't mind following me forward 2 more slides to 11 of 39, what you see is the 5-year attribution numbers. And I'll just note briefly here that, again, the selection effect is really what dominates the outperformance of the WRS pension over this period, with positive performance in several other areas as well. But what we really see here is strong results in private equity, strong results in fixed income, in marketable alternatives, and in private real assets, contributing to that outperformance over that 5-year period. And I think Sam did a nice job of putting that into dollar terms, but it's many hundreds of millions of dollars in performance over that 5-year period. On page 12, the next slide, we just do the quick snapshot of peers. To me, of the 3 things we look at to see how successful the Wyoming retirement system has been, the first is whether you're able to outperform that actuarial assumed rate of return. That was done for the year. And as Sam and Dave noted, you've also been able to outpace that current actuarial assumed rate over the longer periods as well. That gets you better funded, and that helps you pay the benefits that you have promised. That's really, really important. To me, the next most important piece is whether you're beating your policy benchmark. You have also done that over the periods shown, except for the most recent quarter. And then finally, the third and least important, but I think interesting piece of information is whether you're outperforming your peers over those periods. So that just gives you a sense for, hey, are there other groups out there who are finding a better mousetrap in the asset allocation department? Should there be things we should be thinking about? And so this slide is the proof statement for how has the system done relative to those peers. And what you see is that the total fund relative to peers has performed very, very well across all time periods. When you look at the 1 year, 2, 5, 7, and 10, you see that you're in the top quartile among your peer group. That's those numbers in parentheticals. And then when you look at your blended benchmark, it also outperforms and is above median over all those time periods. But importantly, had you just been passively invested in your benchmark, you would not have seen top quartile results over the last 10 years. So that's where we get back to that selection effect. The actual implementation of the portfolio has added meaningful value to the WRS pension for that period. I will conclude my comments on page 14, which is the risk statistics report. I believe when I was here a few months ago, we covered this as well. But the fourth thing that we look at when we're evaluating the success of a program is, okay, so I just highlighted for you all that the WRS portfolio outperformed its benchmark and its peers and the actuarial assumed rate over the last 1 and 3 years and 5 years. But is it doing that by taking on unnecessary or very significant risk relative to the broader marketplace? And what this page helps us highlight is what that risk looks like. And there are a lot of measures of risk. Here, we're sort of highlighting the annualized standard deviation of the portfolio relative to its benchmark as one of those metrics. And what you see is that for the 1 year period, the annualized standard deviation of 6.65 is just under the standard blended benchmark. So to me, that's positive. You continue on for the 2 years, it is also under by almost 40 basis points. For 3 years, it's under by a bit. And then as you get to 5 and 10 years, you see it's slightly above the strategic blended benchmark within about 15 to 20 basis points. But when you take a look at what the annualized return over those periods are, it's significantly better than benchmark, which if you look at some of the statistics on the right, sort of highlights for you with a lot of positive numbers that ultimately the risk that is being taken in this portfolio is resulting in stronger outcomes. And so to me, that provides a lot of comfort around portfolio performance. With that, I will offer to answer any questions. Otherwise, I can turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions? Senator Hicks.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chairman, so when I look at this, and I don't know if this is a question for Makita, but maybe Sam and.
Could you clarify the page you're going to ask a question on?
It's a number of pages because we've seen the same trend for the 1 year, the 3 year, and the 5 year. And the one that's the tailwind, the one that keeps dragging, it looks down, and it's based on the description here, is when we look at marketable equities, and it talks about manager selection was the detractor. And that's a consistent trend that we see on the 1, 3, and 5 year. So the question is if how do we adjust that to start moving that? So our manager selection, I'm trying to understand, we've got a continual consistent trend over 5 years now that manager selection is a tailwind or a drag on the returns. So what are we doing to address that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great question. So it's important to highlight that we're managing a total portfolio, and if we're overweight somewhere, we have to be underweight somewhere else. And so we've been overweight some great managers in marketable alternatives. The offset for that is that we've been underweight equity, and in some cases, the types of exposures in equity that show up as selection effect. So that's a big part of it. Another part of it is, I don't know if you've heard the expression, the Magnificent Seven, but it's it's sort of the nickname for the 7 large technology stocks. So Apple, Google, Netflix, NVIDIA, et cetera. And most active managers tend to be underweight those stocks. And those stocks have been producing most of the market's return. So looking over the last year, the Russell 3000, which is a broad measure of US stocks, was up 23%. Excluding the Mag 7, it was only up 13.5. So active management has been very challenging in the US, and I think even in emerging markets with Taiwan Semiconductor, for instance, which was up 45% or something in the first half of this year. And so a lot of active funds are underweight that, so they underperform. So that's part of what's driving it. But yeah, it's an excellent point. So we're always looking at our exposures and trying to understand that. I think we can make some tweaks to improve equity, but we'll still be facing those potential headwinds from underweight to Mag 7 and overweight to marketable alternatives.
Thank you for that explanation, because that all makes sense now.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I might add, we have made a few tweaks to the portfolio. We have had some moves in the portfolio over the last few months to in some public equity managers, but most of the effect is exactly what Sam said.
All right, thank you.
And your consultant with Makita, she had her hand up a moment ago, and I think would like to offer some perspective. So please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one additional comment, which is to note that during the last year as well, one of the big impacts when you look at manager selection, and this is really a challenge in the way that we or anyone else produces attribution reporting, it combines all of the various components of the portfolio. So in this case, in marketable equity, it's your emerging market equity, your developed markets, and your public US markets. And the developed international market equity portfolio is to some degree hedged against foreign currencies. And in the periods in question, the FX component of that, so the currency overlay that is part of it, actually had a pretty significant negative effect. So I simply wanted to help, and I'm sorry that I can't see all of the names from my vantage point here, but for the question that came up, I did want to note that underlying that, most of the individual managers did reasonably well for the periods, and as Sam highlighted, with a few headwinds. But I did want to highlight that trying to protect your assets given that you pay benefits in US dollars is a component of that decision that the board has made at WRS to hedge some of the currency risk. And in this case, it hurt performance.
Okay, thank you for that information, that add-on. Any other questions for the Wyoming retirement system and their performance? Great performance. Keep it up. Yes, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. I would like to highlight one other additional thing I did put in the board's packet, or the committee's packet, about our upcoming supplemental budget request. I realize this is not the Joint Appropriations Committee, but there's a substantial overlap in the membership, and you all talk. And I do think it was helpful to let the legislature know kind of what we're thinking for the upcoming supplemental budget. I'm probably well over my skis here, Mr. Chairman, because it hasn't gone through the governor's office yet, and you may not see these two items. But the Retirement Board last week in Pinedale did approve moving forward with two supplemental budget requests, one of which is the second request. The second priority is once again request the restoration of the analyst position that we lost 5 years ago when we reclassified an analyst to a needed investment accountant. The top priority request relates to this committee's work on proper investment team structure and strategy, and it relates to how we manage our junior investment staff. The footnote that exists in the current budget is pretty restrictive. It says that any increases in compensation for the investment team has to require legislative approval, but that tends to frustrate, can someone get promoted from analyst to senior analyst? What if there's a vacancy? So the existing footnote probably needs to be addressed in some fashion, I believe. And I don't believe that was the legislature's intent. But with these junior folks, we do think it is useful to be able to move them along and keep them if we can. If you have an analyst that's been with us for a number of period of years, and he's proven that the person has good potential, has demonstrated contributions to the team, you'd like to be able to retain that individual. But if there's no slot for them to be a senior analyst, then you might have a problem. In Wall Street, as a private company, you wouldn't do that. You would promote the person in place because you don't want to become a farm team for your competitors. And of course, at some point, yes, there has to be a slot. If you want to be the chief investment officer of the Wyoming retirement system, yes, you will have to wait until Sam dies, retires, or moves on, or as I call it, DRM. And I think that's also true of our senior investment officer positions. But at the junior level, we would like to, the request is to kind of manage that as a group and have some flexibility in bands. And there's some examples of that in state government where we do that with attorneys in the AG's office and so on. So that's what that budget request is about, is to allow the board to decide when someone is qualified to move between analyst and senior analyst or senior analyst and investment officer. And at any given time, the system could have 3 newbies or 3 really senior quality folks, and who knows what will happen, but let the board have oversight over that, since they deal with these people on a quarterly basis and really on a weekly basis on the investment committee. But that's that request, and we'll see whether it survives contact and gets to you.
Thank you for sharing that. Representative Larson.
Thank you. And as we've had conversations on employee compensation over the last few years, the other part of that is the conversation on compression. And this seems to me that would perhaps contribute to compression. If you've got a junior analyst here and you're saying that there's not a slot for him here, but we're going to give him the raise anyway. So then the senior analyst says, well, now the junior analyst is getting more than I am, and we've got this compression. I'm not necessarily arguing against your request or what you're doing, but I think that there's a conversation that probably ought to be contemplated in along some of those avenues as some of us listen to this request as you come forward, just trying to help you be ready.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's a good point. The board would be, I would propose that the board be in place of judging the experience and skill of all these positions so that they could be managed as a group and they would be aware of all that. The existing situation can actually be worse for compression, in my view, because there's a great deal of pressure to hire someone at a higher wage, someone right out of school, and go to the max, because if you can't ever change their compensation once they're hired, well, then they get trapped. And what you really want to do is you want to hire someone at about 85% of market, 90% of market, and then see if they're going to perform. And if they do, then you give them gradual raises to move them to market over time. And eventually, they are qualified to kind of take the next step and become a senior analyst or an investment officer. But those kinds of judgments are best left at the kind of the local level or with the board. And it's difficult to legislate those things. And we don't want to lose the talent, because it's the talent that's produced these results that we discussed with you today.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Please.
And please understand that I'm just trying to prepare you for a future conversation, and you present your experience with the situation with employees in front of a group who have all had employees and understand the challenges with compression and meeting a budget. And so we've lived in this world too. And so just give that some thought, some delicate thought on how to help us better understand and justify, and you present a fair argument, but just again, look forward to the conversation and want to be able to support, but I think we has to taste good.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, and I invite any ideas. I think everybody is of the same thought. We want to have a system that attracts and also retains the investment talent that we've kind of grown. And eventually you're going to lose some folks for a variety of reasons. People will want to move on to do different kinds of work. As you know, we don't trade individual stocks and bonds. We investigate and hire managers. If you want to do that other kind of work, you may have to bloom elsewhere. And then people move mostly for family reasons. And so there will always be some vacancies, and it's not always related to compensation. But as long as we can, if we can retain an analyst for just a little bit longer than maybe we would have, then I think that'll be helpful to returns to the system.
Sam, did you have something to offer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think I would like to highlight too that this would only affect the 3 most junior positions. So it's not like it's impacting dozens of people. It's really just a few of them. And so we've hired these younger people and developed them over the last 3, 4, 5 years. We really don't want to lose them because we don't have the ability to promote or give raises. And we're even restricted from giving raises. If an analyst said that he wanted got another job offer and he wanted a $5,000 raise, we don't have the ability to do that except going through the legislative process, which obviously is too much of a delay to be effective.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Swindell, or Mr. Masudi, remind me, I know you've given this to us before, but where Wyoming retirement system stands in terms of its total cost for management compared to your peers.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, overall, we're running at about 9 basis points of assets under management, and the average amongst peer systems from a consultant report, still pretty recent, was 10.8. So that's for everything, not just the investment team. So that's about 15 to 20% less than average in public pension funds in the United States.
Right. follow up.
Follow up?
And by that, I assume you mean certainly looking at just total numbers, number of folks within the system and number of dollars managed.
Right, that says Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, that says expresses basis points as a percentage of assets under management.
Mr. Masudi, you want to add on to that?
Oh, yeah, it is a clarification. That's for operation of the entire system for all functions. For the investment group, it's much lower than that. Right, 3.5.
Yeah, for the investment operations, it's about 3.5 basis points.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. Representative Knapp.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I'm trying to understand the junior analyst structure, basically, because I'm going to compare it to, say, firefighters. Firefighter, you got a firefighter 1, firefighter 2, firefighter 3, and as soon as they go through the skills of a firefighter 1, sometimes they're automatically moved to a firefighter 2. Now, the analyst positions, I know, you hire a junior, you give them so much allocation. Once they have that down, you kind of broaden their scope so that they get more education. Is this simply a shift of going to the next level, or is it actual positions that they have to fill and then you've got to backfill their position? So in other words, if you have 3 junior analysts, do they all have the opportunity to become senior analysts, or does it involve actual position changes?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Knapp, great question. The situation right now is that, yes, it tends to require a slot. It's not based upon your demonstrated skill or experience. And that can be a problem. And we're looking for some method to address or mitigate that issue.
Any further questions for the retirement system? All right, very good. Thank you, Mr. Swindell. All right, I think we're all set. Thank you for being here, Mr. Swindell, Mr. Masudi. Certainly appreciate the update, and have a great day. With that, committee, we are semi on schedule. We're ready for our noon lunch break. We come back at 1, we'll try and come back. We're scheduled to come back at 1:30. We'll come back at 1:30 and pick up our 10:30 item at 1:30 and then be back on schedule immediately. So see you all at 1:30.